Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunted Sleep. I know many of you tune in to these stories to help you drift off to sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. I've never considered myself to have any special kind of extrasensory perception, but when I was a child, I often heard the sound of two women talking about their embroidery in a specific part of the garden. I remember telling my mother about it once, but she was horrified that her child might be hearing voices, especially since her brother was a psychiatrist. She just said, "No, you didn't, dear," and that was the end of it. After that, I avoided bringing it up. But the strange thing was, I continued to hear those two women occasionally for years, up until we moved away when I was about 11. The only other time I mentioned them was once, when I was running across the lawn. The conversation was so clear that I stopped in my tracks and called my friend over to ask her if she heard the voices too. But she didn't know what I was talking about. Since then, I've had two very specific experiences as an adult that I can't explain in any other way except as paranormal. One of these experiences took place in Southampton, UK, and I'll tell you about it here. I know it's a typical story in the paranormal genre, but it's absolutely genuine. It happened in 1994 or so, and although I remember the incident clearly, I don't actually remember why I was there. I do remember it was a Sunday because I thought I might stop by the department store if Sunday trading had started. I don't remember the exact time of day, but it was daylight. The weather was clear, and there was very little traffic. I was driving along a road nearly parallel to the high street in Southampton, heading towards a department store. I think it was Palmerston Road. I was a little way behind a medium-sized white van. The road was very open, with grass and a few scattered trees far beyond the pavement. It was a long, straight road, so I had a good view of what was ahead. As I was looking ahead, beyond the van, I noticed a woman walking along the left side of the road, very close to the edge of the pavement. It seemed strange because the pavement was wide, and she didn't need to be so close to the road. It made me feel uneasy, even from a distance. I actually had time to think that the van in front of me should slow down because it was getting too close to her. Then, as I watched in horror, the woman suddenly lurched off the pavement right into the path of the van. It happened so fast. I instantly knew that there was no way she could have survived this. Panicking, I slammed on my brakes, trying to avoid making the situation worse. I stopped dead in the middle of the road, tires screeching. Fortunately, there was nothing behind me. But when I looked up, expecting to see the van stop, or at least see the aftermath of a terrible crash, something even stranger happened. The van kept driving on, as if nothing had happened. And the woman who had walked into its path was completely gone. There was no body, no sign of her anywhere. She wasn't lying in the road, and there was nowhere for her to hide. She was just gone, like she had never been there. I sat there in the car, shocked and confused, trying to figure out what I had actually seen. – 2010 was a strange year. I was backpacking through Europe, feeling cold, damp, and incredibly lonely. I finally made my way to London, where I found a job as a barman in a small Victorian pub, frequented by regulars from the surrounding offices. I think it was called the Lion's Head, but I'm not sure. I ended up sharing a flat with two fellow Aussies, but I hardly saw them since they were roadies for a rock band that toured the UK and Holland. Don't ask me the name of the band. I thought they were rubbish and have forgotten their name. This meant I stayed in a beautiful old Victorian manor practically for free. The building was divided into apartments, but the top floor was empty, so I had the whole place to myself. No one stayed in the room above for some reason, something I was about to find out for myself. My date with destiny came one wet Sunday afternoon. I was alone, as usual, reading The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, with rain tapping at the window like fingers. I had a beer sitting at my feet, and was really engrossed in the book when I suddenly heard someone walking up the stairs. Since the lads were touring Wales, I thought someone might have broken in. I got up and went into the hallway, where I caught a glimpse of someone walking up the stairs to the floor above. Now I knew I was by myself, so I frowned and followed them up. As I got closer, I realized something disturbing. The person was wearing a wedding dress. A wedding dress. What the hell? I quickened my pace, but by the time I reached the top of the stairs, the person had vanished. The hallway was completely empty. I stood there, confused and unnerved. There was no way anyone could have disappeared like that. It felt as though the person wasn't, well, of this world. I didn't tell my flatmates when they came back. I didn't want them to think I was on something other than beer. But every night after work, I could feel her presence, like she was watching me from just above my head in the darkness. During the day, I explored the top floor, and the rooms were all empty, except for one large room that made me feel uneasy. I saw her again, walking up the stairs, as if she was burdened by something. I didn't feel scared, just deeply sad. Eventually, I found out who she was and why she was haunting the building. One of the regulars at the pub told me one evening that he knew where I was staying and asked if I'd seen Agna. I had no idea who Agna was, so he told me this story. In 1890, Agna was about to marry a wealthy young man named Martin Proctor. Martin was an up-and-coming lawyer, but he wasn't interested in marriage. In fact, he was gay and in love with his best friend. So Martin and his lover decided to kill Agna. They lured her into a room, the same room that made you feel uneasy, I guess, and his boyfriend hit her in the head with a hammer, killing her instantly. They stuffed her body into a trunk and left it in the attic. They vanished, and her parents were heartbroken. They sold the house, which was meant to be her wedding present, and moved abroad. The house changed hands several times, and in 1930, the new owner began seeing a woman in a wedding dress, walking up the stairs and then disappearing. The trunk with Agna's body was never found, and it's said that her spirit still tries to show people where it is. I've always been very spiritual. One of my earliest memories as a child is of a tall, dark figure walking towards me while I was sitting on a footstool at my mum's house. The house had once been a slaughterhouse in the 19th century, and this figure would walk between our house and the two houses next to ours. He felt like a very malevolent presence, and eventually, my mum had to bring in a psychic to remove him. As I grew older, I saw many more strange things, some of them very nasty, which I don't want to get into. But through it all, I always had the feeling that something was following me. After I had my son 6 years ago, I moved to a brand new bungalow. I was the first tenant. At first, everything was fine, but after about 6 months, odd things began happening. Doors would slam and then open again. My son's toys would play their music on their own in the middle of the night, and a very unsettling noise began to happen in the hallway every night. It sounded like a heavy step followed by dragging, step drag, all the way to the bathroom. Then, a few hours later, it would start again. One evening, I was sitting in the living room when a heavy black figure appeared in front of me. It moved across the room, climbed up the wall, and vanished through the ceiling. Things kept escalating. After my fiancée moved in, my son's bedroom became the main focus of the strange happenings. The room would fill with smoke, and there was a burning smell that we couldn't explain. Despite having inspections, we never found a source for the smoke. We eventually moved, but whatever was in the bungalow clearly followed us. A few months ago, I came home from dropping my son off at school and found the downstairs filled with a smoky mist and the burning smell again. I knew then that it had found us. Since then, things have only gotten worse. We hear bangs, the sitting room door opens on its own, and the handle moves down even when the door is shut properly. My son, now sharing his room with his younger sister, has woken up screaming because something was banging on his window. He said it was inside his bedroom and heard someone saying something he couldn't understand. One Sunday afternoon, I was cooking dinner when a Pyrex casserole dish was suddenly thrown at me from one end of the kitchen to the other, hitting the backs of my legs. I'd been pinched by unseen hands and had my clothes pulled. Once, my fiancé watched as our 19-month-old daughter was pushed across the sitting room by an unseen force. It scared all of us. The weird occurrences don't stop there. Our acoustic guitar started strumming by itself, just one string over and over again, until I yelled at it to stop. And at 4 a.m. one morning, both my fiancé and I woke up suddenly as something jumped on our bed and started bouncing. It stopped as soon as we woke up, as if it were satisfied with scaring us. My son regularly hears his name being called, just like I did as a child. I'm sharing this in the hope that I can get some answers. I contacted my local spiritualist church, and one man there said I needed to communicate with the entity and tell it to leave. He believes it's a low-level spirit thriving off our negative emotions we have plenty of right now, especially with the stress of wanting to leave the area and my fiancé facing redundancy. The more scared we are, the stronger it seems to get. However, the man from the church refuses to come to our house. He says I should do it myself. I need to wait for a day when the kids aren't around, sit alone in a circle of candles, ask for protection from my spiritual guide, and then confront the entity. He says I should ask it what it wants and then tell it to leave. My mother has had many strange experiences throughout her life. Her first one happened when she was about 13 or 14 years old. She lived in a house I've mentioned before in Black Figure Appears During Storms. For those who haven't read it or for others who need a refresher, I'll describe the layout of the house in more detail. As you entered the front door, there was an L-shaped hallway that led into a reception room with the study next to it. There were also patio doors leading out into the garden. From the reception room, you would walk into another hallway, with the living room to your left and the back door to your right. Next to the back door was a staircase on the right, with the kitchen door to the left. If you walked through the living room, you could see through the dining room and into the kitchen, as the rooms were connected by archways instead of doors. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms, 2 on the left and 1 on the right, with a large bathroom next to it. The stairs to the attic were directly above the main staircase. The attic had a small hallway and 2 rooms, one of which was an actual attic, and the other was a bedroom, located on the left. My mother had a Labrador retriever named Sarah, who had a beautiful golden coat. Whenever my mum felt sad, Sarah would sit by her feet to comfort her. Sadly, Sarah died when my mum was 13, after having to be put down for a reason my mum can't remember. The day Sarah passed away, my mum was in her room, upset by the news. Despite the cold weather, she felt a warmth at her feet. She looked down and saw a golden glow. The glow faded, and when she looked up, she saw the ghost of a dog, a Labrador retriever, standing by the door. The dog vanished shortly after. My mum always said that whenever she felt sad, she would experience the same warm glow, and sometimes she would see the dog. This happened in every room, but most often in the living room, where Sarah used to sleep. My stepfather also had a strange experience when he was 12 years old. At the time, he lived in Wales, and down the end of his road was an old, abandoned house. My stepfather and his twin brother often played in the house, even though it had no upper floors. Those had fallen through long before they moved there. One day, after school, they looked at the house to check if anyone was inside. They always did this before entering to make sure they wouldn't get caught. As my stepfather was looking up at one of the upper windows, he saw an old woman with long, gray hair staring at them and shaking her head. He instantly knew it couldn't have been a real person since there was no upper floor. He pointed it out to his brother, and the two of them ran home. Later, they found out the house was haunted, which was why no one had bought it, and the council hadn't demolished it. After that, they never played in the house again. When I was about 18, I moved into a shared house with a few friends in a small town in the Forest of Dean, Gloucestershire. The house belonged to the dad of one of my housemates, and he rented it to us for a reasonable price. It was perfect for us at the time. The first strange incident happened before I even moved in. I stayed at the house one night to avoid driving home. My girlfriend and I were lying on an airbed in the living room, just about to fall asleep when I heard her take a sharp breath, like she had been startled. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "There's someone in the corner of the room." I jumped up and turned on the lights, but the room was empty. She swore she saw a tall figure standing in the shadowy corner of the room, but I saw nothing, so I dismissed it as a bad dream. Despite this, I decided to move into the empty room when the previous tenants suddenly left. The house had 4 housemates, 3 guys and 1 girl, plus 1 girlfriend who never went home. It was a social hub, and we always had guests over, with parties happening regularly. The house had 3 bedrooms upstairs and 1 downstairs, which used to be a parlor. There was a living room, kitchen, and a small shower room. One of my housemates, Claire, was the only female. She often mentioned that, late at night, she would hear whispering outside her room, long after everyone had gone to bed. She would throw open the door and shout to see who was there, but the whispering would stop. I can't confirm what happened, but I trust her and know she wouldn't make it up. My first real encounter happened one afternoon when I was alone in the living room, watching TV. The rest of the house was out, so I was enjoying some peace. The living room had a unique setup where, if you sat in a certain spot, you could see the TV but also face the doorway and look through to the stairs. I glanced up and saw a pair of legs walking up the stairs. I jumped up and went to check, thinking someone had come home, but there was no one there. I checked everyone's rooms, but they were all empty. Interestingly, 2 people later told me they had seen the same thing at different times. While the house was old, and the creaks could probably be explained by the building's age, there was one incident that still haunts me. It happened a few weeks later. Jack, the owner's son, and I were in the living room, chatting and having beers. Late at night, we decided to call it a night. After checking the doors were locked, we both went to our separate rooms to sleep. But 5 minutes later, I heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. The way the house was laid out meant the footsteps would have had to pass my room on the way to Jack's room. Sure enough, I heard the footsteps walk past my room and stop outside Jack's door. I hesitated but finally summoned the courage to peek outside. There was no one there. As I looked, Jack's door opened, and he emerged, asking if I had heard the footsteps. We searched the entire house. Every door, window, and room, nothing was out of place. We even called Tom, our other housemate, to ask if he had come home during his night shift. He was still at work, and his manager confirmed it. We couldn't find any explanation, and needless to say, I didn't sleep much that night. I only lived in the house for about 8 months before Jack's dad decided to sell it. After we had cleared out, Jack and I decided to take some photos of the place for the estate agents. As we snapped pictures of the front of the house, Jack turned pale when he saw the last one. In the photo, there appeared to be a figure standing in the window of Jack's old room. The figure was blurry, but there was a face, though the features were hard to make out. We immediately packed up and left. A few months later, I ran into Jack's dad at a local pub. We had a drink, and I mentioned the strange things that had happened in the house. He then told me something that gave me chills. He said the house had once belonged to his aunt and uncle, and when his aunt died, he inherited it. His uncle had passed away a few years before, after falling down the stairs and breaking his hip at the bottom. The bedroom where he had slept with his wife was the same room Jack stayed in while we lived there. It started like any other night. My friends, Rebecca, Joseph, Harge, and I, were sitting around watching TV, bored out of our minds. Someone, I can't remember who, suggested we try out the old Ouija board I had found a couple of weeks before while cleaning out my garage. I didn't think much of it, as my parents aren't very religious, and I figured they must have used it at some point. I never heard any scary stories about it, so I didn't think it was a big deal. I figured it was just a bit of fun, nothing serious. I was very wrong. I found the board, but the wooden planchette was missing, so we had to use a drinking glass instead. After about 10 minutes of joking around and trying to scare each other, we finally decided to give it a proper go. We were calm, too calm, considering we were about to try to contact the dead. I didn't know the rules, so we decided Joseph, the oldest, should take charge and be the one to ask the questions. At first, there were some failed attempts and some giggles from all of us, including Joseph. But then, he suddenly shouted, "Is anyone there?" To our surprise, the glass began to move slowly across the board. Everyone accused each other of moving it. We went through the numbers and letters, laughing it off, until Joseph asked, "Who are you?" The glass stopped and spelled out, "Damon." We all looked at each other, wondering if anyone recognized the name. Nobody did. Then Joseph asked it to repeat, and this time the glass spelled, "Damien." That's when it hit me. I remembered Damien, my childhood neighbor. He wasn't someone I was close to, but I knew him. He was killed in a car accident when we were around 14 years old. I hadn't thought about him in years, but here I was, in a room with 3 people who knew nothing about him, and the Ouija board was spelling out his name. It was too weird to ignore. I asked the board who this Damien was and where he was from, and the glass moved again. It spelled out my hometown, and when I asked where I used to live, it dragged itself to 4-8, the correct house number. At that moment, I became really anxious. The others could see it too, and though they told me to calm down, I couldn't believe what was happening. I didn't want to believe it. In a panic, I asked if I could leave the game and just watch. Joseph was reluctant, but I insisted. He continued asking the questions. I then asked, "If you're really Damien, where did we go most Fridays after school?" The glass slowly moved and spelled out, "TUNNELS." I froze. The tunnels were a place we used to explore on Friday afternoons. They were shallow water tunnels, just big enough for us to crawl through. We'd race through them, trying to avoid getting wet. I couldn't believe it. There was no way they could have known about this. I wasn't touching the glass anymore. At this point, I started to cry uncontrollably. I didn't want to play anymore. I knew this wasn't a coincidence. The board started spelling out threats, calling out the names of my relatives, both alive and deceased. I begged them to stop, but the glass spun violently, ignoring all our attempts to ask questions. Then something happened that I'll never forget. The glass, still under the light pressure of our fingers, suddenly lifted off the board. It must have jumped at least a foot into the air. The 3 of us were staring in disbelief, with no way to explain how it could have happened. The glass crashed back down onto the board, smashing into tiny pieces. We just sat there, stunned and confused, trying to understand what we had just witnessed. Although we stayed friends after that night, things were never the same. Once you experience something like that, it's hard to go back to life as it was. It made me question everything I once thought was true about life and death. "5 years ago, on New Year's Eve, my best friend Will and I were out cruising in his car. Everyone we knew was either doing their own thing or staying in, so we decided to take a drive. We didn't have much money to go out drinking, especially after Christmas, so we thought we'd put 10 pounds in the tank and just drive around. It started off like any other night. We were just cruising around, having a laugh. But for some reason, Will decided to take us through Cannock Chase, which is about 2 miles from our hometown of Hednesford. Cannock Chase is known for strange sightings, things like black panthers, a large snake, and even a creature that some claim resembles Bigfoot or a werewolf. After about an hour and a half of driving, it was getting close to midnight. I'd brought a couple of cans of lager with me to ring in the new year, so we decided to park up in a quiet spot. We tuned the car's stereo to the radio, listening to Big Ben's chimes as the new year arrived. We cracked open our cans and made a toast. We stayed there for about another half an hour, just chatting and enjoying the moment. But then, out of nowhere, Will suddenly flinched and asked, "Did you just move your arm behind me?" I was holding my kin with one hand and my phone with the other, so I didn't move at all. Before I could respond, Will slammed the car into first gear, floored the accelerator, and we were off, spinning down the road. We had parked about 300 meters from the Baptist College, and as we rushed past the building, I could see Will wasn't looking where he was going. We flew over the junction and into a gravel car park across from it. Will yanked the handbrake, spinning the car around 180 degrees, and then suddenly jumped out of the car, stumbling and throwing up. Confused and a bit angry, I shouted, "What the bloody hell are you doing, you idiot?" As I looked at him under the car's interior light, I could see the fear in his eyes. His face had gone completely white. He just stared at me for a moment, then said, "I saw a black shadow move from behind you and across the back of me. Let's just get out of here," he said, still looking shaken, and he floored the car again, racing out of the car park and heading up towards Pie Green. But the weirdness didn't stop there. As we drove, the car suddenly lost power. Will kept trying to accelerate, but even when he shifted from third into first gear, the car was barely moving. It felt like something was holding it back. He was pressing the pedal all the way down, but the car wasn't responding. It was so strange, like something was deliberately preventing us from moving. We slowly made it to the next junction, and after turning left, the car suddenly regained its power. Will slammed his foot on the gas, and we quickly got off Cannock Chase. We pulled into a car park at the bottom end of Pie Green, and when we stopped, Will turned off the engine and said, "Al, I don't know what that was, but it scared the crap out of me." I could tell Will wasn't playing a prank on me, especially from the way he looked and how shaken he was. Whatever it was that we encountered that night, it definitely scared us both. So, I thought I'd share this story with you. A few weeks later, I had another experience that left me shaken. It wasn't nearly as scary as that night, but it was still strange. I was driving across the chase, just after I'd passed my driving test, when I glanced in the rearview mirror. To my surprise, I saw the figure of my late granddad John, who had passed away from cancer in the mid-90s. He was sitting in the back seat, smiling at me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was him. Since then, I've driven past the spot where the strange events happened many times, both during the day and night. I've never seen anything like it again, but that night still haunts me. The Heath is a large pond surrounded by acres of grassland and hills, located on the outskirts of our town. In the summer, it's like a local beach. People lay out their towels, enjoy the sun, and relax. But when it gets colder and darker, it becomes overgrown and mostly forgotten. The story I want to share is about a hill in the Heath that we call Hangers Hill. Different people have their own versions of the story, but the basics are always the same. A long time ago, the hill was used to hang people who were wrongly accused and executed for things they hadn't done. Many of the strange experiences people have there involve a ditch at the side of the hill. Some say they hear choking or spluttering sounds, almost like someone gasping for air. If they go to the ditch, they say they see a man standing by the tree in the middle of the hill. He tilts his head back and looks up at the tree, and then he disappears. This isn't what happened to me, though. Last year, my friends and I decided to visit the hill. I was 17 or 18, and we were all pretty interested in the paranormal. It was January, and it was already dark by about 6 p.m. We drove to the Heath and parked up. We were planning to camp on Hangers Hill and see if we could experience anything strange. I parked my car on a dirt road behind the Heath. As we were walking toward the hill, we saw a woman walking her dog. She came up to us and started talking, just being friendly. After a while, she asked what we were doing. Rob, one of my friends, told her we were just curious about the stories we'd heard about Hangers Hill. As soon as he said that, her face dropped. It was like her whole attitude changed. She suddenly looked defensive or worried. She stared at Rob, then said, "You know what you've been told. She quickly called her dog and made an excuse to leave, and we continued walking toward the hill. When we got there, we started setting up the tent at the top of the hill. It was freezing cold, and I thought we might end up leaving in the middle of the night because of the weather. We waited outside for a while, but after hearing nothing, we went into the tent to try to stay warm. That's when things started to get weird. We started hearing a noise, something that sounded like digging, but not like a fox or animal. It was the sharp scrape of metal on rock, followed by a squelching sound as something was lifted and thrown. We quickly jumped out of the tent to see if anything was happening, but the noise stopped immediately, and everything went quiet. We sat down on a log near the tree where the man was said to appear. We waited again, and after about 5 minutes the noise started up again. It was so close, it sounded like it was right next to us, but we couldn't see anything making the sound. We listened for a while, shocked and confused, and then it stopped again. We waited for what felt like 90 minutes, not saying much except for some shocked comments. After a while of nothing happening, I decided to take a walk around the pond with Lewis. As we walked along the dirt path, we turned a corner. On either side of the path were thick bushes, and overhanging the pond were 2 large willow trees that created a beautiful clearing. I felt drawn to it, and as I walked closer, Lewis grabbed my arm and stopped me. That's when I saw him. There was a man crouched by the water, washing his face or drinking. It was about 1 a.m. at this point. He didn't acknowledge us, and it was like we were in 2 different worlds. He didn't seem to see us at all. He wore a white or gray button-up shirt and brown trousers with no shoes. His skin was so pale, almost translucent. When he stood up, I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, and fear rushed over me. It felt like we were intruding on something, and I suddenly felt very unwelcome. Lewis and I started to back away, my heart racing, but I couldn't stop looking. As the man stood up, he moved into the thick bushes across from the clearing. No branches moved, and there was no sound. We ran back to the tent, grabbed our things, and left the hill immediately. We've gone back to the heath in the daytime since then, but we've never been back to Hangers Hill at night. My name's Bliss, and I'm 14 years old. Ever since I can remember, strange things have been happening in my house. We moved into this house right after I was born, and my mum says that's when the weird stuff started happening. She believes that since moving here, the family hasn't been as happy as we were in our old house. She says this house brings negative energy, and I agree with her because I can feel it too. The house is built on land where there used to be a church. My mum told me that King Henry, I'm not sure which one, set all the churches on fire because he didn't believe in Catholicism. When the church was set on fire, all the monks inside were killed too. When I was about 5 years old, I came out of the kitchen crying, saying I had seen a man in a black cloak staring at me. My sister, who's 22 now, saw the same man in black on the stairs leading to the attic when she was younger. But she didn't experience as much as I did, and my dad never saw or felt anything, as far as I know. My mum says she often smells roses in the house. It's not related to the monks, but it's because her mum, who passed away, loved roses. My mum already believes in spirits, but my dad always told me it was just my imagination and that spirits aren't real. My mum eventually called a spiritual woman to ask about what was happening in our house. The woman said, "Your youngest daughter has had a lot of experiences, and there are spirits in your house. But only she can see and hear them. They're not dangerous." My mum didn't tell me this until I was older. By the time I was about 8, I had gotten used to hearing strange sounds around the house. It just felt normal. For example, I'd often hear someone whisper my name, Bliss, and I'd hear lights flickering, objects being picked up and put down, or even things going missing. Sometimes, when I was walking up the stairs, I'd see the end of the black cloak dragging on the floor as if the monk was walking behind me. I would talk to whatever it was, telling it I was scared and asking it to leave me alone. Whenever I did this, the strange noises would stop, but only for about a month before it would return again. This went on until I was about 11 or 12 years old. After that, when I became a teenager, I stopped noticing anything strange. I didn't even think about it anymore because nothing weird was happening. My house felt very depressing, and I spent most of my time out of the house. My mum started worrying about me because I seemed sad all the time, so she called another spiritual woman to get rid of the spirits. She didn't tell me this until months later. The woman said she got rid of them over the phone, and for a while, nothing happened. But lately, things have started happening again, and it's starting to freak me out. Someone switched on my music without me touching it. The microwave turned on by itself, without me setting a timer or even touching it. I've heard footsteps walking around the house when I'm alone, and objects are being picked up and set down without explanation. There's also a small door in my room that sometimes opens on its own, or it opens slowly when I'm in the room. I haven't seen the monk since I was 11, but now I'm starting to wonder why these things are happening again, and what it wants. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It happened when I was around 8 or 9 years old, on a Friday evening around 7 p.m. My parents and I were in the living room downstairs, watching a movie. The room was well lit and cozy, and there was nothing unusual about it. It was raining outside, but inside it felt warm and comforting with my family around. I had been tired all day and decided it was time to go to bed. After saying goodnight to my parents, I headed up the stairs. The stairs were on the left side of the corridor, and the kitchen, where the incident occurred, was not lit. There was a coat hanging on the door, and the kitchen was mostly obscured by the banister of the stairs. However, from halfway up the stairs, I could still see a part of it. As I was walking up, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It looked like someone was standing in the kitchen, watching me walk up the stairs. I turned to look, and the figure darted behind the door so quickly that I couldn't make out any details. My first instinct was to scream that someone was in the kitchen, and I rushed up the stairs to the landing. But when I got there, I saw something even more disturbing. There was another figure in my parents' bed. Keep in mind, it was just me, my mom, and dad at home at the time. I couldn't make out much about either figure. All I could remember was that they both had yellowish skin and completely bald heads, and they were very thin. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, and I was terrified. My heart was racing, and I froze on the landing, trying to block it out by closing my eyes. Suddenly, my dad came running, shouting, "What is it?" I screamed. "There was a man in the kitchen and in your room." My parents immediately started checking the house, looking for these people I had seen. But we found nothing. My dad tried to explain it away, saying that the first figure could have been caused by the coat on the door, and the second one was just my imagination because I'd been startled. Even though that explanation made sense, I didn't believe it. The door had moved when the figure darted behind it, and the coat was brushed, which seemed impossible for just a coat to do. Since that night, I'd been terrified of walking up the stairs. Even now, I walk up them backward, which I know sounds stupid and dangerous, but I just can't turn my back on those stairs. I also avoid looking into my parents' room, and soon, I'll have to move in there, which brings back those nightmares. Life went back to normal after that, at least in terms of the strange occurrences. About 6 months later, the memory of the kitchen and bedroom incident faded from my mind, and I was back to playing on my Game Boy for hours. One night, while lying in bed with the lights on, I was playing Pokemon. After saving my game, I turned off the console. The door to my room was open, and the landing light was on. My bed was in the far corner, with the door to my right side, so I couldn't see outside, and no one could see inside unless they came into the room. I sat there for a moment, then I clicked my fingers. That's when something creepy happened. It wasn't as dramatic as the first incident, but it was still unsettling. I saw a shadow of someone standing in the doorway. The figure was dressed in robes, and holding some kind of long staff. The landing light cast a shadow across my room. My older brother was asleep on the other side of the room, with his back to the door, so even if he had been awake, he wouldn't have seen it. The shadow stood there for a few seconds, then vanished as soon as I blinked and rubbed my eyes. It was like something straight out of a movie. I sat there in awe, too scared to move, and didn't sleep the whole night until my parents returned home. One night, my nan and granddad were going out, and my mom and siblings had already been sent to bed. After hearing them leave, my mom and my Aunt Kim stayed up talking. The light was off, and they were all in their own beds when suddenly the toilet upstairs flushed. My mom thought it was her youngest sister, Tracy, but Tracy had snuck into bed with my Aunt Kim before the flush. No one else was in the house except them. My mom would tell me that sometimes, if she stood at the top of the stairs, she could see shadows of people walking past downstairs when no one was there. They also had a workroom for my granddad upstairs. My mum said whenever you were in that room, it felt like someone was standing at the door, watching you. One time, my mum got excluded from school and was sent home when both my nan and granddad were at work. She was alone in the house. After a while, she fell asleep and woke up to see someone standing on the other side of the room. The figure looked like my nan and was shouting at her for not being in school. But then the front door opened, and my nan walked in. After moving out, my mum lived in a small one-bedroom house and got a dog. One night, after being out with her boyfriend, she came home and went straight to run a bath. As she was waiting in the bedroom, she noticed the dog was staring at the bedroom door and barking, though she ignored it. After the bath, she got into bed and tried to sleep. But she was woken up by the dog growling and backing up on the bed. The dog was staring at the door. My mum got up and went to the bedroom door, which was open. She saw a white misty figure coming up the stairs. She just said, "I'll speak to you tomorrow, I'm tired," and went back to bed. The next morning, my mum got a call from my nan, who told her that my great-nan had passed away the night before. My mum believes it was her great-nan coming to say goodbye. When my mum had my two older brothers and sisters, she and my dad got lovebirds. At first, everything was fine, but then at night, the birds would go crazy, flapping about and making noise. The next morning, they would find blood everywhere, and it terrified them. One time, when my mum and dad went out, they left my oldest sister to babysit. She heard running across the hallway and thought it was my brother messing around. When she went upstairs to check, she saw a little boy run across the hallway and into my brother's room. My sister followed to tell him off, but he was fast asleep. It happened a few more times that night, but she eventually shrugged it off. When my mum had me, I was in my cot upstairs in my room. One night, she heard me crying and sent my dad to check on me. As he walked up the stairs, he heard someone singing a lullaby to me. When he reached my room and pushed the door open, he saw a black figure standing at the end of my cot. My dad ran back downstairs without going in to get me. That experience really freaked everyone out, so we decided to move. We moved into the house I live in now. Since then, nothing strange has happened here, although my mum did mess with a Ouija board when she was drunk. We used to visit my auntie in London a lot. One time, she wanted to use the Ouija board to try and contact my granddad. I was sent upstairs the first night they did it to look after my youngest cousin. While I was up there, I kept getting strange chills down one side of my body, even though the heating was on and there were no drafts. It freaked me out, so I just tried to sleep. The next night, I was allowed to sit downstairs while they played with the board. Apparently, it was my granddad who was speaking through the board because it answered the questions correctly. He even said he was in the TV, watching us. The next day, when we went downstairs, one of the seats on the three-seater sofa was freezing cold. My auntie couldn't explain it, and everyone assumed it was my granddad sitting there. Back in 1984, when I was 14, a group of my school friends and I decided to try a Ouija board at my friend's garage. It was a dark night, and we had candles lit around a small chess table. We used a whiskey tumbler with a coin on top to ensure no one could move the glass during the session. We didn't really know much about Ouija boards, but we were curious. Our self-appointed leader, Jason, assured us he knew how to use the board. He started by asking the usual question: "Is anyone there?" After a few attempts, the glass began to move. It was slow at first, and we all blamed each other, thinking someone was pushing it. But when we asked the spirit's name, it spelled out, "Damon." Then, Damien. None of us recognized the name, but something felt off. I suddenly remembered a childhood friend named Damien who had tragically passed away in a car accident. I didn't tell anyone at first, but as the session continued, the board confirmed details only I would know about Damien, like the place he lived. The atmosphere began to shift, and I felt an odd energy in the room. The glass started moving more violently, knocking over Scrabble letters. It felt like something was growing stronger, and I was starting to get scared. Then, we asked what flowers Damien would want us to bring to his grave, and I had an odd experience. I saw a clear image of a yellow daffodil in my mind, and shortly after, the board spelled out, "Daffodil." That connection made me uneasy. I felt like something else was at play here, something that wasn't Damien. The atmosphere got more tense. The table seemed to move on its own, and we heard strange bangs in the garage. I asked if we could stop, but the board spelled out, "No." My friend Paul and I decided to back off, leaving the rest of the group behind. When we stepped outside, Jason came out later, saying the spirit had threatened us, something about hurting our hands and faces. It wasn't clear why or how, but it rattled us. We went back inside, apologized, but didn't return to the board. Afterward, we decided to dispose of the board and its pieces. We took everything, the table, Scrabble letters, and the tumbler, and smashed the glass in a gully behind the house. At that moment, without saying anything, all of us just ran off in different directions, like we had all been spooked into doing it. A few days later, the group tried the Ouija board again without me and Paul. They claimed they reached Damien again, and the spirit even mentioned us by name. I wasn't sure if they were trying to scare us or if something really happened, but the experience still affected me. Later that night, while walking with Paul, something strange happened. I offered him a crisp, and as he reached for it, I felt a powerful shock go through me. It wasn't like an electric shock, but more of a surge of energy that settled into my jaw and cheekbone. My mouth became dry, and I nearly choked on the crisp. I stepped back, freaked out, and Paul seemed startled by my reaction. It was unlike anything I had ever felt. That evening, I touched a metal fence on my walk home, and the same thing happened again, another surge of energy in my body. It was terrifying, and I couldn't describe it, but it made me feel like something was wrong. Over the next few weeks, I had night sweats and couldn't sleep properly. I became convinced that whatever happened during that Ouija session had left some kind of lasting effect on me. I've thought a lot about it since then, wondering if it was a spirit, some collective energy from all of us, or something even more difficult to explain. Whatever it was enough to make me swear off Ouija boards for good. I haven't touched one since, and I don't plan to ever again. I grew up in a farmhouse in a small village called Leppington, in North Yorkshire, England. The house used to be a large detached home but was split into two semi-detached houses. This meant we had neighbors very close by. I lived there with my parents and my brothers Dom and Seb. Some of the paranormal experiences I'm about to share happened to them as well, and I gathered some details by asking them about their own experiences. The first memory I have is from when I was about 3 or 4 years old. I had my own room at the far end of the house, up the stairs and through a small corridor. Every night, my mum would put me to bed, turn on some soothing music, and leave. But I would often find it hard to sleep, and I remember seeing a black shape moving across the room near my bed. Then, the music player would suddenly be thrown across the room. I'd run to my parents' bedroom in fear, and each morning I would be found curled up on the carpet. One night, my mum decided to stay with me and see what was going on. That night, she witnessed the same thing. She heard the music player fly across the room. She immediately moved me to my brother's room, and my old room was left empty, now known as the spare room. For a few years, things were quieter. We heard some knocks and bangs around the house, but we chalked it up to the house being over 100 years old, and maybe some noisy neighbors. But when I was 6, something strange happened. We had a French exchange student stay with us, and on the 5th day, he began complaining of nightmares about a black figure with red eyes chasing him every night. He begged to go home, and my parents took him to a French-speaking lady in the next town. I remember feeling scared of the spare room after that, convinced something sinister was there. My parents never mentioned anything unusual, but I wonder if the neighbors had their own stories. In 2000, when I was 7, my parents split up, and I moved with my mom to a new house. We kept going to my dad's house every Friday night. At first, there were no major incidents, but over time, I started to feel uneasy in the house. The feeling of being watched became almost constant, especially when I was alone. I also heard tapping on the walls and strange noises, but it wasn't until 2004 to 2008, when it was just me and my brother Dom at my dad's, that things got more unsettling. The spare room was still a source of unease. Whenever I went near it, I felt like I was being watched. Dom once told me that an old man, mentally ill, had been locked in that room about 100 years ago and left to die. This story made me even more paranoid. We would often stay up late, watching scary TV shows like A Haunting and scaring ourselves even more. One night, in July 2009, Dom heard loud footsteps coming from upstairs, where our parents' bedroom was. When he checked, there was no one there, but the noise was real, and it really freaked him out. In March 2010, I turned 17, and I started staying at my dad's house less frequently. I would go on alternate weekends, but one night, while we were staying there, I heard strange sounds again. It was around 1:45 a.m., and I heard the sound of my dad's bedroom door opening and footsteps heading toward the bathroom. I thought nothing of it at first, but when I checked, the bathroom door was open and the light was off. I asked Dom if he had heard it, and he had. We both heard the footsteps again and the bathroom door close. But there was no one in the house at that time. The summer of 2010 was the last time I stayed at my dad's house. One night, while I was asleep, I had a nightmare about a black figure standing over me. I woke up unable to open my eyes, feeling pinned to the bed. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw nothing, but I was still terrified. I could feel the weight of something pressing down on me. Dom woke up and asked if I was okay, but I didn't tell him about the nightmare. I was so scared that I never stayed there again. In 2012, I moved to York for a while, but financial issues brought me back to Westo. My dad is renovating the old house now, and I'm worried that it might stir up the spirits again. When I told him about everything that happened, he laughed it off and offered other explanations. He's a true skeptic. I grew up in a house in Hull, England, built on land where houses had been bombed during World War II. The house was an end-of-terrace property, and we had a large garden, partly because the neighboring houses had been destroyed. My family, including my mom, dad, and 2 younger sisters, moved in when I was very young, and strange things started happening almost immediately. One of the first things I remember was when I was around 3 or 4 years old. I had my own room at the far end of the house. Every night, my mom would put me to bed, turn on some soothing music, and leave the room. But soon, I started noticing that my toys, especially my teddies, would be moved to different places around the room. I was too young to understand what was going on, but I was frightened. My mum says she never touched them, and I believe her. It was as if something was moving them on its own. Then, something even stranger happened. One day, all 3 of us, my sisters and I, saw a woman in a blue dress walking through the garden. We all described her the same way. She walked through the garden and disappeared through the wall. At the time, we were too young to know what it meant, but it scared us. When we told my mom, we pointed to the bricked-up gateway in the garden where we had seen her. My mom didn't think much of it, but it stayed with me. As I got older, the strange occurrences became more frequent. When I was about 10, my mom invited a French student to stay with us. He was friendly, but after a few days, he became ill and was bedridden. He began to have nightmares about a black figure with red eyes chasing him. He begged my mom to let him go home, so she took him to a French-speaking lady in the next town, and he left. I was really scared after that, and I started feeling uneasy in the house. When my parents split up, we moved to a new house, but I still had to visit my dad on weekends. I stayed at his house with my sisters, but things there were just as strange. I started hearing knocks, bangs, and footsteps when no one was around. Sometimes, it felt like I was being watched. One night, my dad and I both heard loud footsteps walking across the floor upstairs when there was no one there. We checked every room, but no one was around. As I grew older, I started experiencing even stranger things. At 14, I began hearing more unsettling noises, like loud bangs and knocks from upstairs. My sisters and I sometimes saw shadows and felt like someone was in the room with us, even when no one was there. One night, while I was alone in my room, I heard someone whisper my name. It was just like a voice in my ear, but there was no one around. I was scared out of my mind, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Over time, I started to feel more comfortable in the house again, but the strange events never stopped completely. I think I just got used to it. But it wasn't until I was much older, and had moved away for a while, that I started to really think about everything that had happened. Looking back, I realize how much those experiences affected me and my family. Even now, when I visit my parents' house, I can't shake the feeling that something is still there. It all started during a particularly tough time in my life. My mom had been very ill for a long time, and I had moved back home to care for her. At the same time, my grandmother was also unwell, so I was juggling taking care of both of them. One night, just before my mom's birthday, I was running back and forth between my mom's bedroom and my grandmother's house. It was a lot to manage, and I was feeling the pressure. I was downstairs, rushing to get everything done, when something strange happened. I was in my mom's bedroom, preparing for another busy night, when suddenly the mirror on the wall flew off and hit me in the head. At first, I thought I was imagining it, so I put the mirror back in place and carried on. But then, as I walked out of the room, the same thing happened again. This time, I was more rattled but didn't think much of it. I had other things on my mind. That's when I heard a knock at the door. It was some family friends bringing my mom a birthday card. I opened the door to them, and after chatting for a moment, I went back upstairs. But when I got to the bedroom, the mirror had fallen off again. I was frustrated, and a little unnerved, but I still tried to brush it off. I then went to my mom, who was talking about the family business and stressing out. After a tense moment, I snapped and shouted at her to stop talking about it for now. Just as I did, the mirror flew off the wall with a loud whack. I couldn't take it anymore. In a panic, I left to visit my grandmother, trying to escape the strange happenings. The next morning, things took a darker turn. I was at work when I received a frantic call from my mom. She was in a state, saying she needed help. I rushed out of the shop, driving 120 miles per hour to get home. When I arrived, I found her in a terrible state. I called the nurses, and by the time they arrived, they called an ambulance. My mom was admitted straight to the hospital, and the doctors gave us the worst news imaginable. She was dying. But the next day, something miraculous happened. She was suddenly sitting up, talking, and the doctors were baffled. They couldn't explain it. They thought she had made a recovery. But just a few days later, she took a turn for the worse, and we were told to prepare ourselves. The doctor said that some people rally before they pass away. The very next morning, my mum asked a strange question. She wanted to know if she had died the night before because she said she saw my deceased grandfather, who told her she had to fight and go back. It was a bizarre moment that left us all wondering. The next day, my grandmother came to see her. As she left the ward, she turned around to see my mum waving at her. This was impossible, as my mum hadn't been out of bed in weeks. My grandma was in shock and left quickly, not knowing that it would be the last time she saw my mum. That night, while I stayed with her, something strange happened. I received a text from a friend, a chain message about love and angels. I didn't think much of it and ignored it, replying to my friend about my mum's condition. Little did I know, the message's timing was eerily significant. At exactly 11:09 a.m. the next morning, my mum passed away. We were devastated, but what happened next still haunts me. A few days later, I was at home preparing for the funeral, trying to calm myself down. I went into my room to roll a cigarette and stashed it in my usual place, my underwear drawer. I turned on the shower, and as I was standing by the window, I heard someone rummaging through my drawers. I panicked, thinking my family had returned. But when I went to check, the room was empty, and everything was in disarray. My stash was on the bed, and the drawers were wide open. Nobody had been in the house, except for me. I knew my mum didn't approve of drugs, and I felt like she was sending me a message. A week later, I went on a search to find my mum's old friend, who had drifted away from us. I drove to the town she had moved to and asked around. Finally, I walked into a pub and asked if anyone knew her. It was a funeral wake, and a woman I recognized from my childhood walked out. It turned out to be my mum's old friend, and she told me she had only come to work that shift to cover for someone else. It felt like fate that I found her so easily. Then, as I sat staring out the window, I remembered the text I received the night before my mum passed away. My friend had sent it, and I realized that I had unknowingly received the message at exactly the same time that my mum had passed. I didn't share the coincidence with my friend at the time, but when I called her, she admitted that she noticed the timing too but didn't want to upset me. In the days that followed, the grief was overwhelming. My mum had been such a vibrant and glamorous woman, and I wanted to send her off in the best way possible. I went to the chapel of rest and did her hair, nails, and makeup before anyone else arrived. She looked beautiful, like the illness had never touched her. The moment my younger cousins and relatives went to say their goodbyes, I stood aside, letting them have their moment. But when my younger brother entered, I followed him in. We weren't the most affectionate siblings, but as I put my arms around him, comforting him, the lights started flickering off and on. The atmosphere in the room shifted, and a strange smell filled the air. It was like my mum was there, somehow letting us know she was close. Then, as my dad stood outside, holding my 4-month-old niece, he whispered a kiss to her. To everyone's astonishment, she puckered her lips and kissed him right on the lips, even though she was too young to comprehend such gestures. It was as if she knew exactly what he wanted. These experiences have stayed with me, from the haunting moments to the bittersweet goodbyes. My mum may be gone, but in many ways I still feel her presence, especially when I smell that familiar scent. It's as if she's letting me know she's still watching over us. This happened when I was in primary school, which was in Scotland. My school was an old building with 2 floors, 15 classrooms, a nursery, and a few storage cupboards. It's a bit of a surprise that I remember all the details, but I do. The building had actually been used as a hospital during one of the world wars, I'm not sure which one, and a lot of people died there. That was something we learned about in school, and it always gave the place an eerie feeling. Anyway, on to the strange encounter I had. It probably sounds a bit unbelievable, but it stuck with me. It all started at the beginning of the year when we got 2 new pupils, Louisa and Jake. They both seemed normal at first. I quickly became friends with Jake, but Louisa was different. She would always wander around on her own, staying in the shadows, not really talking to anyone. Most people didn't pay much attention to her, and some didn't even notice her existence at all. One day, during playtime, I saw Louisa doing her usual thing, wandering around, staying in the shadows. I went over to her and asked if she wanted to play tag with me and a few of my other friends. To my surprise, she shouted, "No!" right in my face. I was taken aback but just walked away, not thinking too much about it. The next day, Louisa didn't come to school. We later heard the news that she had committed suicide the night before. It was a shock, but no one really knew what to say about it. Soon after, we got another new girl, but this one was even stranger. On her first day, no one seemed to notice her, not even the teacher. She wandered around outside just like Louisa used to, sticking to the shadows. I thought I'd try again and asked her if she wanted to play tag with me. When I said this, she stepped out from the shadow she was standing in and moved towards me. I remember feeling this strange urge to look down at the ground, and when I did, I noticed something that really freaked me out. She didn't have a shadow. I froze for a moment, and then just ran away from her. That was the last I saw of her. Later, when I asked my teacher about the girl, she just looked confused and asked me what girl I was talking about. No one else seemed to have seen her. A few years later, when I moved up to high school, I had another strange experience in the drama studios. The new building we were using for drama lessons was a bit creepy, especially the drama rooms themselves. They were completely black, with blackout curtains on the walls and blackout blinds on the windows. The ceiling was slanted and covered in black tiles. Every time I walked into those rooms, I got this uncomfortable feeling like someone was watching me. Even though the building was brand new, there was something unsettling about it. One of the oddest things that happened was when my friend and I stayed behind after school to practice for an extra session. We were the only ones in the room, but we noticed the curtains moving, even though there was no one near them. The lights would flicker all the time, and there was always this cold draft down the back of your neck. It got even stranger when we used the cameras for our docudrama projects. The footage would come out all corrupted and fuzzy, even though we were using brand new tapes that no one had touched before. Sometimes, when we stood in a certain spot in the class, the camera would pick us up, but we would blend into the background. We would literally go completely black, like we had disappeared. All of these things were small, but they definitely made me feel like something was going on. Looking back, I don't know if it was just my imagination or if there was something more to these experiences. But there was definitely something about that place that didn't sit right with me. I grew up in Kokomo, Indiana, in a family that, though very religious on both sides, didn't practice much religion at home. I've always wondered if strange, paranormal events happen to me for a reason or if they're just random, and it's something that happens to a lot of people. When I was around 5 or 6 years old, we lived in a small but cozy house. My grandmother, who was very religious and kind, came to live with us during her last few months. Since there wasn't enough room for all of us, I had to sleep in the living room. One night, I was trying to sleep when I heard the VCR in the living room turn on by itself. I could hear buttons clicking and a tape ejecting and going back in, but when I looked over, no one was there. The lights on the VCR were on, but there was no one around to be controlling it. That was my first memory of something unusual happening. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, my parents divorced. My grandmother passed away, and my dad was renovating her house to sell it. My mom wanted to live there, so after she got custody of my sister and me, my dad gave her the house. I began to experience some strange things in that house. A few years after my mom remarried, my stepdad got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. He had to pass my room to get there, and when he walked back, I saw a man dressed all in white with shoulder-length hair walk past my room, following him. At the time, I wasn't scared, but looking back, it's pretty unsettling. Other strange things also happened. I would see shadowy figures running into my room, and the cats would avoid it entirely. I'd even hear someone calling my name in the middle of the night. After several years of not getting along with my mom, I moved out, and I only visited on weekends. I still feel uneasy in that house to this day. I later moved back in with my dad and stepmom. They had built a house together, and I lived there for 10 years. There was a huge barn on the property, which my dad had bought mainly for that. He spent the summer cleaning it out, but lightning struck and burned it down. After it happened, my stepmom told me that my dad had found dead chickens and some strange, satanic items in the barn. For 10 years, I didn't experience anything unusual in the house, though my stepmom often told me about strange things happening to her and my dad. The first time I had an experience there was a few years ago, after I had broken up with my son's father. I was staying at my parents' house a lot. One night, I was sitting on the bed, watching a movie on my laptop when I noticed the lamp beside me started vibrating. It was really weird and made me uncomfortable because my son was sleeping in the next room. When I was 19, I moved out of my parents' house to live with my boyfriend in Elwood, about an hour away. He had bought a house out in the country, and it was old. There was also an old barn next to the house. At night, I would avoid going into that barn because it felt creepy. My boyfriend worked the night shift, so I was often alone. One evening, while sitting at the computer, the lights in the house suddenly went out. There were no storms, and the power just went off. I called the electric company, and they said there were no outages in the area. The power stayed off for about an hour before it came back on. I called the electric company again to thank them, but they told me they hadn't done anything to fix it. That really scared me. A few months later, I moved in with my best friend, Stacy, in Kokomo. We partied a lot and had fun, but strange things happened in the house. Stacy and I both heard footsteps in the living room, scratching sounds on the walls, and we were both having nightmares. I didn't stay there long, and I moved back in with my dad and stepmom. Again, I didn't experience anything in their house, but my parents continued to have their own experiences. In 2007, I got my first apartment. I lived there alone for a month before my boyfriend moved in with me. About 8 to 9 months later, I became pregnant with my first son. That's when the strange things started to happen again. I had a nightmare one night that something was in my room, messing with my fan. I tried to wake my boyfriend, but I couldn't. When I finally woke up, I was shaking and screaming. A few days later, my boyfriend told me he had heard a growl when I was waking him up. That really scared me. After my boyfriend and I broke up, I stayed at a friend's house for a while. One morning, after my friend left for work, I tried to go back to sleep, but I had the overwhelming feeling that something was hovering over me or watching me. It was the most uncomfortable feeling I've ever had. Whatever it was didn't want me there. I left the house shortly after my friend left. Now that my boyfriend and I are back together, we've moved into a new apartment and are expecting our second child. I really hope that nothing follows us into this new place. I still don't know if I'm being followed or if I'm just sensitive to the paranormal. A couple of weeks ago, it was my best friend's birthday. She lives near an old pigsty that you can see from her garden. She always said it was haunted, but none of us really believed her. She thought it was haunted by the pigs that had once lived there and the man who owned them. I remember a few years ago, my friend came to school looking upset. She told us that the man who owned the pigs had abandoned them, leaving them to die in the pigsty. She could hear them squealing every night, but of course, it stopped after they all died, probably from starvation. Not long after that, the man died of a heart attack. I think animals like foxes had taken the pigs away because there was nothing left in the pigsty after that. Anyway, it was her birthday, and we were camping that night. Around 10:30, my friend suggested we go ghost hunting in the pigsty. Nobody wanted to go except me, so we went together with just one torch between us. Before I tell you what happened, let me explain the layout of the building so you can understand what I'm talking about. The pigsty is shaped like a long rectangle with 2 rows of 8 square sections. There's a doorway in the middle, so there are 4 sections on either side of you. There are also 2 doorways at each corner of the building. There's a little alley running along the length of the building and around its edges. The walls dividing the sections are only up to our knees, and for some reason, there's a barbecue in one of the sections to the left. We entered the building through the middle entrance, and the barbecue was in the section closest to us on the left. We walked out that entrance, went around the building, and entered through the right bottom corner. When we got there, the barbecue had moved to a section 2 away from us. There was no noise, and nobody else was around. We left that entrance, and went to the top right corner entrance. Again, the barbecue had moved. It was now diagonally across in the section closest to us. By this point, we were both a bit freaked out. My friend wanted to leave, but I went up to the barbecue and touched the lid and handles. It was cold to the touch. Next, we went around to the top left entrance. Once again, the barbecue had moved, and now it was 4 sections away from us. That's when my friend completely chickened out and ran back to her house. I quickly followed because I saw a dark figure moving in the alley. We told our friends about what had happened, and they all wanted to see it for themselves. So, all 10 of us girls went back to the pigsty. Everyone split up and went through different entrances to see if the barbecue would move again. But with so many people going in and out of the entrances, the barbecue stayed in place and didn't move at all. However, I kept seeing that dark figure running around. After a while, it started to get silly, so we decided to head back and get into our sleeping bags. It was a fun night, but every so often, I could still hear the sound of pigs squealing in the distance. It was the summer of 2005, and I was living in a large house in Lydney, Gloucestershire, with my good friends Laura, Jim, Barry, Steve, and Collie. We were all aware of some strange happenings in the house, but we didn't talk about it much. Barry's grandfather had passed away there about 10 years before, and I think that lingered in our minds a bit. There were stories shared among us. Laura had seen an old man standing at the end of her bed. Steve claimed he was touched on the neck when he was alone in the kitchen, things like that. As for me, I hadn't experienced anything unusual before. I went to bed, slept well, and never heard a thing. But that was all about to change. My first ghostly experience happened in broad daylight, which might surprise you. I woke up around 9:30 a.m. and went downstairs to the kitchen to make my breakfast. It was unusually quiet, but I just assumed everyone was still asleep. The kitchen was large, with a big window that always seemed to be open. To the left of it was the door that led outside, the front door. I was just about to grab my toast from the toaster when I heard someone running toward the front door. Being a bit of a prankster at the time, I thought it would be hilarious to open the door quickly and wave my hot toast in whoever's face was about to knock. So I rushed to the door, but when I got there, I noticed it was already slightly ajar. As I pushed the door open fully, I saw a pair of trainers and part of someone's legs run past the door, followed by a little giggle. I quickly opened the door and called out, "Laura!" But the legs and trainers ran down the front lawn and disappeared before my eyes. And just to be clear, I've never touched narcotics, so I wasn't imagining things. Since it was daylight, I didn't feel scared at first. I ran outside to check, but there was no one there. I knocked on everyone's doors inside the house, but nobody was home. I was alone, and that's when a chill ran up my spine. That evening, I told everyone about what happened, but they all thought I was joking, as I was known for being a bit of a prankster. Later that night, when it got dark and I had to go to bed, the events from earlier started to play on my mind. Had I really seen a pair of trainers and legs running down the drive and disappearing? All I know is that it happened, and I couldn't explain it. To this day, it still makes me wonder. Could it have been a relative? The trainers looked old, like something from the 70s. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. My mother still works at a care home to this day. 3 years ago, she helped me get a job there when I was 18 and looking for work. The only issue was that the job was for night shifts. At the time, there were 5 residents in the home. From the moment I first stepped inside, I could sense something strange in the air. I'd heard many stories about the place but didn't believe any of them. Things like doors banging, handles rattling, the usual ghostly stories. A few months into the job, I experienced something that changed my mind. One night, I heard a loud groan. Thinking it was one of the residents, I went down the hallway to check. But all of them were sound asleep. I thought maybe one of them had just been dreaming. However, as I walked back down the corridor, I had this overwhelming feeling that someone was standing behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. I was in the kitchen one evening, making myself a snack, when I heard a knock on the window, as if someone was outside. But there was no way for anyone to get outside unless they unlocked the doors. All the doors were locked for safety reasons because the residents had learning disabilities and needed help with everyday tasks. Even the fire exits were alarmed, so there was no way anyone could get out without triggering it. A few months later, during the Christmas holiday, my colleague and I decided to have a snack. While I was sitting in the lounge, she stood in the doorway and gasped. As I turned to look, we both saw a gray figure walk past her down the corridor. What struck us as most unusual was that the figure had its own shadow, even though there was no light source near it. The very next night, my colleague and I heard a door handle shaking, as though one of the residents was trying to get out of their room. We rushed to open the door, only to find that the resident was fast asleep. To this day, a loud groan, sounding like an old woman, can be heard, even when the residents are out for the day. Faces sometimes appear in the top corners of the rooms, and it's something that no one can explain. Before it was turned into a care home, the building had been a home for an elderly man and his dog. The man would often play the piano, and when the building was converted into a care home, the piano remained. However, staff started complaining about hearing the piano play on its own, and they eventually had to take it away. One night, I had the chance to work with the manager, and she told me about some of the strange things that happened when she first started. She told me about a resident who had always smiled at a friend that nobody could see. When this friend passed away, the resident stopped smiling. But about a week later, the resident began looking up at the ceiling and smiling again. The staff thought nothing of it until one day, while helping him to the toilet, they heard him say, "Leave me alone." This was especially unsettling because this resident had severe learning disabilities and couldn't speak. They used to have baby monitors in each room, but they kept picking up strange interference. Sometimes on the other end, you'd hear voices or sounds that didn't make sense. Some of this, I suppose, can be explained by radio interference, but it was still unsettling. One of the residents will sometimes look down the corridor and suddenly run into another room, as if startled by something she can't see. Another resident often goes into the dining room and says, "Doggy," which staff believe might be a reference to the man who used to play the piano with his dog. Staff members have also reported seeing people standing outside in the garden at night. This garden is pitch black and very isolated, and it's impossible to see anything out there. I always felt the need to close the blinds in the kitchen and the lounge, as I often felt like someone was watching me through the windows. One day, my mother was standing in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, when she looked behind her and saw a woman in white with long dark hair standing right behind her. My mother screamed, and her colleague had to send her home because she was so shaken up. A while later, the manager shared even more chilling details with me. She brought out some documents from the office, deeds to the building and its history. The building, it turned out, was built on top of an old hospital that had been used for women who had lost their children or had children out of wedlock. Back then, these women were considered mental, and were sent there for treatment. This history added a whole new layer of eeriness to everything that had been happening. "6 years ago, when I was 20, I was pretty naive and living the typical lad's lad lifestyle. I worked 5 days a week and then spent my weekends partying hard with my mates. Then I fell in love with my friend Katie, someone I had known for years, and everything changed. But something I did one night, when I was 20, gave me a huge reality check about messing with things we don't understand. What happened that night is still hard for me to fully grasp, but I know that the terrifying events we experienced made me realize just how much I loved Katie and wanted to be with her forever. It all started after a wild night out with the lads. We ended up at my mate Danny's house for a few more drinks. Somehow, we got onto the subject of Ouija boards. Some of us were skeptical, but my mate Luke was convinced they were real and suggested we try one for a laugh. We weren't overly drunk, just tipsy, so we thought, why not? We cut out some numbers and letters and arranged them in a semicircle around the coffee table. Then, we grabbed an empty glass. There were 6 of us, each of us with a finger on the glass. Luke asked, "Is anyone there?" We all laughed, not taking it seriously. But then, we heard a loud thud come from the kitchen. Carl, sitting closest to the kitchen door, leaned back to look, but saw nothing. As he turned back, the glass on the table suddenly shifted violently from one side to the other. We all looked at each other, accusing Carl of moving it, but when we took our fingers off, the glass shifted again. At that point, we were all pretty freaked out and realized something was going on. We put our fingers back on the glass, and Luke kept asking questions. One of the letters it spelled out was a jumbled mess of letters that didn't make sense at all. Then Dan got angry and shouted, "Can't you G spell, you idiot?" Immediately the glass spelled out Tony, which was his mum's name. It went on to spell out the names of all our mums, which was freaky because only Dan and Luke knew my mum's name. Luke asked, "What do you want?" And for a moment the glass didn't move. Then, he suggested one of us ask it something. We all took turns, and when it got to me, I asked, "What do you want?" At first, there was nothing, but then the glass started vibrating. It did this for a few minutes, and then I got frustrated. Shouting, I demanded, "What do you want?" The glass then spelled out KTY. I only knew one Katie with that spelling, and she was sitting with us. Danny, Luke, and Tank all knew her too. We all looked at each other, wide-eyed, in sheer terror. Dan asked, "What do you want with Katie?" The glass vibrated again and spelled out PIN. We asked again, "What do you want with her?" The glass continued to vibrate and then spelled PIN repeatedly. Luke was getting really concerned now and suggested we stop and call Katie to check on her. We tried calling her, but she didn't answer. At this point, we were all really scared, so we went back to the Ouija board, hurling insults at it, asking, "What the F **K have you done to Katie?" And, "What deal you want from her?" I was crying at this point because I cared deeply for Katie. Then, as a tear rolled down my face, the glass moved again and spelled out SHEDIS. At first, it didn't make sense, but then we realized it meant she dies. I grabbed my phone and called Katie, but Dan called her house. I got nothing, but Dan managed to get through to Katie's sister, who told him that Katie had been rushed to the hospital 10 minutes ago, and her family was on their way to join her. I freaked out, knowing I had to get to the hospital. We couldn't drive because we had been drinking, but luckily a neighbor offered to take me and Dan. When we arrived, we were met by Katie's sister and mom, who told us Katie was in critical condition with a suspected burst appendix. If you know anything about burst appendices, you know they can be lethal. After what felt like forever, we were allowed to see her. Her family went in first, then I went in alone. Seeing her lying in the hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and machines, with the color drained from her face, was heartbreaking. I promised myself that I'd stay by her side no matter what. Thankfully, she made a full recovery, and when she was released from the hospital, I told her how much I loved her. It took a terrifying experience for me to realize just how deep my feelings for her went. I also told her about the Ouija board, and when I explained the details, her face went pale. She told me that she had been lying in bed, watching a program about demonology. when a man came on talking about Ouija boards. As soon as he mentioned them, she felt a sharp pain in her stomach. I asked her what time this happened, and she said it must have been around 1 a.m., the exact same time the Ouija board spelled out her name. Now, 6 years later, we're still together, and I'm planning to propose to her next month. Me and the lads haven't talked about that night since. We all believe that whatever came through that Ouija board that night had something to do with hurting Katie. We'll never understand why it singled her out, or why it spelled out the names of our mums. But one good thing came from it. I realized that I had the love of my life right in front of me all along. And it took her nearly dying for me to see that. I'm an Indian-born psychiatrist working in the UK. In 2009, I experienced an incident that still leaves me in doubt about what really happened. To this day, I struggle to fully understand it. On July 22, 2009, which I remember clearly because it was the day of the longest solar eclipse in history, I was treating a teenage patient. Her parents had brought her in, reporting that she had been acting strangely for the past week, accompanied by unexplained phenomena. I was intrigued but also cautious. The parents mentioned that their daughter spoke in a weird, almost ungodly manner. They didn't understand what had caused this change. I spoke with the girl personally, and based on my observations, I suspected she might be suffering from a psychiatric syndrome. However, the parents revealed something chilling. They said their daughter had killed and eaten her pet cat. This raised red flags. When I looked into her eyes, I was struck by what I saw. Her pupils were strangely pointed, and it seemed like she wasn't actually seeing anything. Her eyelids remained open, and no matter how hard I tried to close them, they wouldn't shut. Her heartbeat was rapid, and her breathing was shallow and labored. I discussed the case with my colleagues, but no one could come to a clear conclusion. By the afternoon, her condition worsened. She began bleeding from her ears and nose, likely due to hypertension. Then, she began screaming uncontrollably, a sound that seemed unnatural. Despite all efforts to calm her, she suddenly collapsed and died. Her parents took her body home that evening. Later that night, I received a call. It was from the same parents who had left the hospital just hours ago. They claimed their daughter had come back to life while her body was being blessed by a local priest, as part of a Catholic ritual. They were in a state of shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. I quickly drove to their home to investigate. When I arrived, the girl was tied to her bed. Her parents explained that she had attacked the priest, injuring him in the process. The house was packed with neighbors, all of whom were bewildered and frightened. They had witnessed the bizarre events and didn't know what to make of it. I entered the room, and for the first time, I experienced something I couldn't explain. Only 5 people were in the room: the girl's parents, the priest, the girl, and me. The priest warned me that this wasn't a matter of psychiatry, but something he described as exorcism. He said that he didn't have the power to cast out the demon, and that he needed help from a more experienced priest. As I looked at the girl, the bizarre things continued. She spoke in 2 voices simultaneously, one high-pitched and the other deep. Her pupils remained pointed, and she seemed to have incredible strength. She grabbed my neck, even though she was tightly bound to the bed. Or maybe it wasn't her. Perhaps it was some invisible force. I know I wasn't imagining it. Something strange had happened. At one point, she seemed to know everything about me, including personal details that no one could have known. I was dumbstruck. I had studied psychiatry for years, but this was something else. She communicated with me in my mind, a kind of telepathy. She told me, "You don't know what you're dealing with." The neighbors were terrified, but I was deeply intrigued, though equally unsettled. After some time, another priest entered the room, claiming to be an officially anointed exorcist by the Vatican. He asked everyone to leave the room. After about half an hour, he emerged with the girl, who now seemed completely normal, as if nothing had happened. I spoke to the priest afterward, hoping for some explanation. What happened in that room? He told me things that I'm not allowed to share, but it made me question everything. Could the priest have been lying, Or did he truly perform an exorcism? I couldn't decide. It was a terrifying experience, but also a challenge for my medical mind to understand. To this day, I remain unsure whether what I witnessed was a real exorcism or if it could be explained by a medical syndrome I had never encountered before. All I know is that it was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my career. A few years ago, I had an experience that still lingers in my mind, and after a recent ghost walk around the city of York on my honeymoon, romantic, I know, the events have been playing on my mind again. I thought I'd share my experience here and see if anyone else has had something similar, especially at Warwick University, where it occurred. Maybe it'll convince my friend that I didn't imagine it. At the time, my best friend and I were around 18 years old. We traveled to Warwick from Manchester to attend a Japanese convention for the weekend. I can't remember the exact dates, but I know it was in August. Since my friend and I were tight on money, we decided to share a room in one of the student dorms at Warwick University instead of booking separate rooms. We were best friends and used to staying in the same bed at each other's houses, so sharing a room was no issue. The dorms were modern, relatively small, and had a typical layout for student living. The room was L-shaped, with a bathroom door on the left as you entered, a desk along one wall to the right, and a single bed opposite. It was simple, and nothing about the room felt strange or unsettling at first. The first 2 days passed without incident, and everything seemed perfectly normal. However, on our final night, we had been out at the local student union, having drinks with some people we'd met. We returned to the dorms, not because we were drunk, but simply because we were chatting and having a good time. We went to bed as usual, and I soon fell asleep. At some point, I woke up in the night. I don't know the exact time, but it was likely around 2 a.m. My friend had shifted in bed and was lying next to me, but I didn't think much of it. However, something didn't feel right. I was lying on my left side, facing the wall, and as I stretched my right arm, I felt something odd next to me. I turned my head and saw my best friend still fast asleep, exactly where she had been. But what was next to me? I was frozen in place, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't my friend. The figure was standing next to the bed, facing the desk. It looked like a woman, though I couldn't see her face clearly, only her outline. She was wearing a white hospital gown or nightdress, with a black cardigan and a white bonnet. The figure was about 5 feet 5 inches tall and skinny, and I could see it moving its hands up and down its arms, as though rubbing them. But there was something off about the way it moved. It was unnatural. Its body was shaking and twitching as if it were anxious or frightened. I sat there, unable to move. I remember looking at the clock, which read 3:30 a.m. When I looked back, the figure was still there, slowly backing away toward the corner of the room. I was too terrified to move, but I finally mustered the courage to cover my face with my hands and say, "Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!" This woke my friend, but I couldn't explain what had happened. She was groggy and didn't really pursue the matter, and I didn't want to talk about it. Eventually, I must have fallen back to sleep, but I was still shaken. The next morning, I told my friend what had happened, and she teased me about it. She made me tell the story to our other friends at the convention, and they were all a little creeped out, but no one made fun of me. The experience stayed with me, though, and I couldn't shake it. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize it. I had a few drinks that night, but in the 8 years since then, I've never experienced anything like this before. I don't typically talk in my sleep, nor do I usually have vivid dreams after drinking. When I think back to that night, everything about the room and my surroundings felt completely real. The figure's presence didn't feel like a dream, it felt real, and I had no explanation for what I saw. I've always believed in ghosts, to some extent, but I can't just chalk this up to a bad dream or my imagination. I've done some research into the history of the area and found some eerie details about the place. The dorms at Warwick University are located near Gibbet Hill, which was once the site of public executions. It said that the university dorms were built on top of a demolished building that had housed the bodies of executed prisoners. Some people have reported hearing the sounds of someone sobbing hysterically, and there's a connection to the history of executions in the area. Could what I saw have been the spirit of someone who had been executed? It was unsettling, and although I didn't feel fear at the time, it still makes me uncomfortable to think about. I truly believe what I saw that night was a ghost, and I hope I never experience anything like it again. I've always tried to be a rational person, skeptical of anything paranormal, and I don't hold any religious beliefs. However, there's something that happened to me as a child that has stayed with me, and it completely contradicts everything I want to believe. The experience has haunted me for years, and I can't shake the feeling that there's something to it, despite my skepticism. Until I was 5 years old, my family and I lived in a large attic flat in an old house in South London. Both my parents, much like me, had a very scientific and rational approach to life. It wasn't until I was much older that I overheard my mother talking to my grandmother about strange experiences they had in that house, which shocked me. My earliest memories are of being around 4 years old and living in constant terror of a large cupboard in my room. I know how it sounds, monsters in the cupboard, but that's the only way I can describe it. I would often have terrifying encounters with something that came out of the cupboard. It wasn't always there, but when it was, I could feel a heavy, oppressive atmosphere in the room. I didn't see it clearly at first, but I knew when it appeared because of this feeling. I would hide my face to avoid looking at its grotesque appearance. The thing would speak to me in a stereotypically scary voice, though I don't remember the specifics of what it said. It seemed to know everything about me, and even though I didn't understand the full meaning of what it said, I tried my best to avoid interacting with it. It didn't always show itself, but when it did, strange things would happen, like the curtains opening and closing on their own and glowing, seemingly solid shapes of light appearing in the room. I was scared, but not as terrified as I would be now. I remember being comforted by my relatives, who didn't seem scared, and so I accepted it as something normal. I never thought of the thing as a human ghost. To me, it was a monster, and I had one recurring nightmare where the monster would call to me from under a bush, trying to lure me under to it. Sometimes it would grab me. I'm not sure if this nightmare was directly caused by the thing in the cupboard or if it was just a manifestation of my fear. When I overheard my mother and grandmother talking about their own experiences in the house, everything came flooding back. My mother told me that there was something not right with the house, particularly my room. She explained that she'd often felt uncomfortable in my bedroom and had experienced strange occurrences, like the door closing and trapping her in the room, even though there was no lock. For this reason, she avoided my room when she could, and tried to keep me out of it. My mother also recounted an experience in the kitchen, where a large casserole dish had inexplicably flown through the air toward her. She demanded whatever caused it to stop, and the strange incidents seemed to cease after that. There were also reports of toys being arranged into strange formations on their own, another common paranormal trope. When guests came to stay, a few of them were given my bedroom and reportedly ended up sleeping in the lounge, though my mother never went into details about what had happened. She did mention that I used to complain about the face in the cupboard door, so they covered it up with a sheet. However, I recall that the sheet was often removed during the night, much like the curtains moved on their own. One incident my mum mentioned occurred one morning when she left me alone in her bedroom while she cleaned the bathroom. She heard me talking and giggling, as if I were having a conversation. When she listened more closely, she could hear me answering questions about my age and what I was doing. Then I said, "Oh, my mummy is in the bathroom," followed by a whispered, "I think she's on the toilet." I guess kids don't have much of a filter. When my mother realized I was having a conversation with someone, she wasn't concerned because I seemed happy and relaxed. She mentioned it to some friends, who owned the property and lived below us. The man, who had often experienced strange things in the house, claimed that it might be his mother, a spirit he often felt was present, and he gave the name that I had mentioned. I have no memory of this, as I was very young, but I remember all the terrifying incidents vividly. This makes me wonder if the house had some sort of spiritual energy, or if I was just a sensitive child. When I think about it now, I still get a chill. I wonder about the people who live in that house now, and whether they are experiencing anything similar. I've looked up different explanations. Some people refer to demons, evil spirits, or negative energy being present, but I still find myself searching for a scientific explanation because, frankly, it scares me to think it could have been something supernatural. I just can't shake the belief that whatever I experienced was real, and I truly hope that science will one day offer an explanation for these phenomena. I'm currently a 17-year-old male living in the south of England. Back in the summer of 1997, when I was just 2 years old, my family and I went on a short holiday to Devon. For those who aren't familiar with England, Devon is a historic region, famous for its ties to witchcraft and folklore. According to my mother, we stayed in a large, beautiful cottage with 5 bedrooms. The events I'm about to share are 100% genuine, though I was too young to remember any of this myself. These stories are based on what my family has told me over the years, and while they may not be in chronological order, they definitely happened. When we first arrived at the cottage, we discovered that the family who owned it was living in a shed in the back of the garden. Curious, my aunt asked the man why they were staying in the garden, and he simply laughed and said, "You'll know soon enough," before handing over the keys. That evening, my grandfather, who, sadly, is no longer with us, was babysitting me while my mother, aunt, grandmother, sister, and cousins went out. He was sitting on the sofa, watching football, or soccer as we call it, when the TV suddenly changed channels on its own. At first, he thought nothing of it, but it happened 2 or 3 more times, and he began to get frustrated. As he grew more irritated, the dinner bell in the kitchen began to ring. For context, a dinner bell is a tool used by maids or chefs to signal that a meal is ready. Another night, my aunt and mother were getting into bed, sharing a double bed together. My mum asked if my aunt was ready for her to turn off the bedside lamp, to which my aunt replied, "Yes." But as soon as my mum switched the lamp off, it immediately flicked back on. They both laughed it off at first, thinking it was a mistake, but when it happened a second time, they still weren't concerned. By the third time, however, my aunt said, "Lynn, if this is a joke, it's not funny anymore." My mum insisted it wasn't a joke. At that point, my aunt decided to ask, "If there's anybody here, give us another sign." That was when things took a terrifying turn. On the far side of their room stood a grand bookshelf facing their bed. Suddenly, a book shot out of the shelf and landed by the bottom of the bed. Then, several more books followed suit, shooting out and landing on the floor. My mum still tells me that she has never been more terrified in her life. This was particularly surprising, as she had lived in 3 separate houses before, all of which were haunted by spirits. On another occasion, my 10-year-old sister got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. When she entered the bathroom, she was startled to find my cousin, who was about 7 years old at the time, already sitting on the toilet. My cousin looked visibly scared and said, "I thought you were the man in the top hat." The last and most disturbing event that happened in the cottage involved me. One night, my mum woke up to a loud bang coming from the room I was sleeping in. When she rushed in, she found me sitting on the floor, giggling to myself. The travel cot I had been sleeping in was much too large for me, with fabric mesh walls that made it impossible for me to climb out on my own. There was no way I could have gotten out of it by myself, and the only explanation my mum and I could come up with was that I had been lifted out. From April 2011 to April 2012, I lived with 5 friends in a shared house in Bow, East London. The house was a typical London terrace, with my bedroom, which I shared with my boyfriend at the time, located at the front of the house, facing the street. There was one bedroom at the back, another on the side, and one downstairs. The living room, kitchen, and bathroom were all located on the ground floor. I've had countless unexplainable experiences in my life, so when strange things started happening in our new house, I wasn't overly surprised. At first, it was the lights in my bedroom constantly switching on and off. This happened about 20 to 30 times a minute. My boyfriend didn't move in until June 2011, but even before then, I had to sit in the dark rather than keep switching the light on. At first, I didn't tell anyone about it, not wanting to freak them out. But eventually, things started happening when there were more people around to witness it. One evening, the lights in the living room started flickering on and off. We asked the landlord to check the electrics, but there was no issue with them. We tried changing light bulbs, but that didn't help either. Once my boyfriend moved in, things started to get really strange. When we wanted some privacy, we would lock our bedroom door, but the door would suddenly fly open. When we tried to turn the knob, we found that the lock was still on, and we'd have to unlock it to close the door. I had a locksmith friend check the door, but he couldn't find anything wrong with the lock. We tested it multiple times, and the same thing kept happening. If the door was locked for longer than 20 minutes, it would always fly open. We couldn't figure it out, so eventually, we just left the door unlocked. On one occasion, my housemate was brushing her teeth in the downstairs bathroom when a cup that was sitting on a flat shelf suddenly flew into the sink and shattered into tiny pieces. There were no open windows or doors, so we couldn't figure out how this could have happened. Another frequent occurrence was hearing footsteps coming from upstairs when no one was there. We'd be sitting in the living room, my bedroom was directly above it, and hear the footsteps moving around. Since the house wasn't attached to any neighbors, we knew no one else could have been up there. The sound was always clear, like someone was walking around upstairs. The most terrifying experience happened when I was alone in bed. My ex had gone away, and I was lying in bed when I heard a loud sigh coming from inside the room. I was too scared to open my eyes, so I just lay there, trying not to move, for about an hour before eventually falling asleep. The next day, I called my boyfriend, and he told me that he had heard the same sigh 2 nights earlier when I had been out. He hadn't told me about it at the time because he didn't want to scare me while he was away. About a month before we moved out, my housemates and I heard tiny footsteps coming from the attic. The attic could only be accessed through one of our housemates' rooms, and she was fast asleep at the time. The footsteps moved from one corner of the attic to the other, then sped up before suddenly stopping. We all looked at each other, and it was clear that we weren't imagining it. One of our friends came to stay with us in the living room for about a week. He hadn't met all the housemates yet, as he arrived late, and the next morning, he was convinced he had had a conversation with a man during the night. The only man in the house that night was my boyfriend, but he didn't match the description of the person my friend described, and he was absolutely sure he hadn't spoken to him. This could have been a dream, but considering all the other strange occurrences, I wasn't so sure. My friend didn't know about the strange happenings in the house, and he was really shaken up by the experience. We tried to find out more about the history of the house from the neighbors. The house had been built before the war and was originally a cobbler's shop. One of the neighbors, who had lived there for over 30 years, told me I should ask him again about the house's history once we had moved out. I didn't get the chance to speak to him again, but I plan on going back to ask more about it. What struck me as odd was that he seemed reluctant to tell us about it while we were living there. My name is Beth, and I'm 14 years old. I live with my dad, mom, and 2 younger siblings, Matt, 9, and Ray, 2. The experiences I'm about to share with you come from stories my dad has told me, as I don't remember them myself. When I was younger, my family lived in half of an old police station in West Bromwich. I believe the building's been knocked down now, but I'm not entirely sure. We lived in the upper part of the building, which was converted into a house, and it had 2 dining rooms, one of which connected to our utility room. I was only about 4 or 5 years old at the time, and I had an imaginary friend who lived in the utility room. His name was Robert. I described him as tall and dark, with a funny voice, which I guess I meant as an accent or pitch. I would often play in that room with him until my brother Matt was born. My dad would ask me, "Beth, why don't you play with Robert anymore?" And I'd reply, "Robert doesn't want to play." Or, "Robert doesn't like the baby." Creepy, right? When Matt was 6, we moved to my dad's great-uncle Ron's house, which had been left to him in Ron's will, R.I.P. Ronnie. It was a lovely house, with 4 stories, including the attic, and it was located on a street called Chapel Lane, with an old, unused Sunday school across the road. We've been living here for about 3 years now, and we love it, but my dad and I both think it's haunted. My mum doesn't share our fascination with ghosts. She gets annoyed if she catches us watching paranormal shows. Despite my mum's reluctance to discuss it, my dad and I have had a few strange experiences in this house, and one of the most recent ones happened just last week, which is what I'm compelled to share with you now. My step-cousin Ashley, God rest her soul, passed away last month at the age of 18 after a battle with lung cancer. She used to always tell me, "Do what you like, have fun, go where you want, and trust what you believe in. You know best." Last week, Ashley's family, my step-cousins Reese, 20, Bradley, 15, Davey, 14, my aunt, and step-uncle, came over to visit. I'm very close with all of them, but especially Brad, who's like a brother to me. One evening, everyone was gathered in the living room, while Brad and I were in the dining room, sitting on my dog's bed. Our dog, Poppy, a 3-year-old chocolate Labrador, was lying in front of us on the floor. Suddenly, she lifted her head, her ears flattened, and she started staring intently at the doorway leading into the kitchen. Brad and I both watched her, confused. Her tail started wagging, but she was also whimpering at the same time. Her tail wagging became faster and stronger, and then she suddenly barked, something she never does. Brad, trying to calm her down, said, "What's the matter, Pops?" And Poppy immediately snapped out of her strange behavior, becoming relaxed as Brad fussed over her. We told the rest of the family what had happened, and my dad jokingly said, "Might be a ghost, eh?" I laughed it off, but my mum scowled and dismissed it, saying, "Don't be stupid," as she shot my dad a look. My dad nodded solemnly and then turned to me, saying, "Your mum's right, it's silly." Later, Brad and I went to my room. I put my out-of-battery phone into my iPod dock to charge. A few moments later, my phone lit up and began playing music, How to Save a Life by The Fray. The song was halfway through, and the line that played was, "Let 'em know that you know best, 'cause after all, you do know best." I was shocked, as I hadn't been listening to that song, and I knew for sure I wasn't playing it before. Brad and I had been listening to Drake earlier, and my phone had died. We'd gone upstairs to charge it so we could continue listening to music. Freaked out, I pulled the phone from the dock and connected it to the charger under my bed. When I told my dad what had happened after the rest of the family left, he was intrigued, but then my mum burst in, looking furious. "I don't want to hear any more of this childish nonsense, Beth and Olivia. It's all bull." I was surprised, as my mum had never sworn at me before. I didn't react as I normally would. I just stared at her and muttered, "Whatever," before heading upstairs. That night, while in bed, I was listening to music on my earphones, scrolling through songs. Suddenly, How to Save a Life started playing again, but this time it was from the same point as before. The volume was turned all the way up, and it almost burst my eardrums. I yanked the earphones out, looked at the screen, and saw a mysterious 9 on it before I threw my phone across the room and bolted to my little sister's room to sleep on the floor. The next morning, I returned to my room and found my bed made. This was strange because my family was still in bed, and no one had been in my room. I sat on the floor, picked up my phone, and found that it was dead again. But what really caught my attention was the 3 long blonde/golden hairs that were lying on my pillow. My family and I all have dark brown hair, and my dad has short blonde hair, but these hairs were much longer than his and definitely weren't anyone else's. I grew up in the northeast of England in a house built in the 1970s, and that's where this story takes place. There was no bad feeling associated with anything that happened there. In fact, I look back on it with a sense of fondness and curiosity. The only time I was really scared was when I was about 10 years old. My dad worked away a lot, and one evening, my mother, my younger brother, who's 2 years older than me, and I were sitting in the living room watching TV. I believe we were watching Hornblower at the time. Out of nowhere, we heard somebody knocking on the door. My mother got up to answer it, but there was nobody there. We lived in a quiet neighborhood in a small village, and it was raining heavily, so we figured it might have just been some kids messing around. Shortly after, as we were still watching TV, we heard, and felt, a series of loud bangs on the wall. The sound seemed to be coming from upstairs, but the bangs were so strong we could feel them vibrating through the sofa. I clearly remember my mother grabbing a broom as a weapon and searching the house. Needless to say, we all slept in the same room that night. A couple of years later, something even stranger happened. I was in my room, sitting on my bed, listening to Green Day music pretty loudly. My brother and my parents were downstairs. As I listened, the volume on the CD player kept turning itself down. I watched as the little display showed the numbers dropping, 15, 14, 13, 12, and so on. Intrigued, I would turn the music back up, only for it to turn down again. Then, out of nowhere, I heard and felt a tremendous bang on the floor next to me. It sounded just like when I jumped off my bed onto the floor, so my dad came running up the stairs, shouting at me for making the noise. But it wasn't me. I told my parents what happened, and my dad, who's quite skeptical, dismissed it. However, my mother took me seriously, as she had experienced strange things both as a child and in that house. One of her experiences happened when I was about 12 or 13. She got up during the night to use the toilet. While she was in the bathroom, she distinctly heard my dad's voice outside the door saying, "Don't flush the chain." When she returned to the bedroom, she found my dad fast asleep. This was especially odd because my parents used to say this to each other when my brother and I were little, as our bedroom was near the bathroom, and they didn't want to wake us with the sound of the flush. The strange thing was, we had lived in a different house at that time. My mom couldn't help but smile when she told me this story the next morning. Another story that stuck with me was one my parents shared. One day, they were giving each other a kiss and a cuddle by the door before my dad left for work when they both heard a child blowing a huge raspberry in the corridor. They were the only ones home at the time, and it shocked them both. They couldn't explain it. There was also a time when everyone was in bed except my dad and me. I was in my room, and my dad was working at the computer in the living room. From where he sat, he could see anyone coming down the stairs. Suddenly, he came into my room and asked if I'd just been in the kitchen. I told him I hadn't. He said he'd seen someone come downstairs, go into the kitchen, and when he followed them, the light was off, and nobody was there. Things also started moving around the house. I was about 17 by this point, and my boyfriend was over. The whole family was sitting in the living room, chatting, when we heard a loud noise coming from the kitchen next door. We rushed in to check, but couldn't find the source of the noise. Then, my mom opened the roll-top lid on the bin and found a full bottle of orange squash inside. The bottle had been on a wine rack on top of the fridge, which was next to the bin. We couldn't understand how it had made its way from the wine rack into the bin, which had its lid closed. It wasn't necessarily scary, but it was definitely perplexing. Another strange incident occurred in the utility room. A screwdriver, which had been sitting on the workbench, suddenly flew across the room. No one was in the room at the time, but we were in the kitchen next door, and we clearly heard the sound of it flying off the bench. I grew up in the northeast of England, and in 2010, I moved into a semi-detached house in Bow, East London, with 2 other girls while I was finishing my final year of university. The house wasn't particularly old, probably built in the 1950s, but it never felt like a welcoming place. I was friends with one of the girls who had lived there the year before, and she had told me that the house had a strange atmosphere. I thought she was exaggerating, but my friend's boyfriend had also mentioned that the house had bad vibes. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to it. But once I moved in, I started to notice strange things happening. It didn't take long for me to pick up on what he had meant. There was a general sense of unease, and the house never felt comfortable. It started with little things, like the lights flickering on and off or feeling like something was watching me, but it quickly escalated. One evening, not long after I moved in, I walked into the living room after work to find one of my housemates, we'll call her Y, sitting on the sofa, watching TV. She told me that our other housemate, S, whose room was directly above the living room, had been walking around in her room all night but had never come downstairs. I told Y that S was still at work, and she didn't believe me until she saw that S's car wasn't parked outside. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe Y had been spooked because she was on her own, and it could have been the sound of footsteps from the house next door. But it wasn't long before I began hearing the same sounds myself. Footsteps seemingly coming from S's room when she wasn't even there. These sounds occurred both when I was on my own and when Y was there with me. Y began to get really uncomfortable in the house. She would sit in the living room with all the doors shut, saying that she didn't feel safe in the house. She even refused to sit on one of the sofas, claiming that it felt like someone was standing behind it. The atmosphere was definitely unsettling. One night, when Y was out and S had gone to bed early, I was still awake, and around midnight, I heard voices coming from the hallway outside my room. Initially, I thought S was on the phone, but as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices were coming from the stairs. Two male voices having a conversation. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I could clearly hear the voices for a few minutes before they stopped. I went to ask S the next day why she had been on the phone at midnight, but she was confused and said she had gone to bed hours earlier. There was another time when Y locked herself out of her room and had to sleep on the sofa. The next morning, she asked me if I had gotten up at around 5 a.m. to use the bathroom. I hadn't, as I had slept through until 10 a.m., so we both assumed it was S who had gone downstairs. But when we asked S, she said she had slept in until late too. Y was adamant that she had heard someone go downstairs, use the bathroom, and then return upstairs, but we couldn't explain it. After that, there were no major incidents, but we continued to hear footsteps. A friend of mine who's sensitive to the paranormal came over to stay for a night and slept on the sofa. He told me that he woke up in the middle of the night to hear heavy breathing in his ear. He told the presence to go away, and it did. As time passed, I started to feel something strange happening in my room. It was like the atmosphere in my room was buzzing, or static, as if the room was full of activity that I couldn't see. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was definitely unsettling. This would happen maybe twice a week, and I would feel as if something was there with me, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. Eventually, I began experiencing sleep paralysis, which I know is not necessarily paranormal but felt worth mentioning. One night, I felt as though I was being lifted up, grabbed by my arms and legs, and was floating uncontrollably toward the ceiling. I couldn't open my eyes, and I tried to scream for help, but no sound came out. It was terrifying, and I've only had one other episode since moving out 2 years ago. About a month after these strange events started, one of my best friends, who is a medium, came to visit me. I hadn't told him anything about what had been happening in the house, as it was just a social visit. But within 10 minutes of entering the house, he turned to me and said, "There's something nasty in here." He mentioned that there was a lot of negative energy, particularly in my room, and he felt that this presence was feeding off the negative energy and trying to spook us. I was shocked because I hadn't said anything to him beforehand. After his visit, things seemed to calm down, but the house still had this uninviting presence, as if whatever was there had gotten bored of scaring us. When I was 17, a group of friends, and I found out about an old abandoned building near a former mental health hospital or care home. I can't quite remember which, but it was called Winterton and was located in a village called Sedgefield. We thought it would be a cool spot to hang out, so we decided to check it out. The building was a 2-story structure made of gray stone, and all the windows were boarded up. We found a big window on the ground floor where the boards had come loose at one corner, so we crawled inside. After exploring the whole building, we guessed that it might have been part of the hospital, possibly a wing reserved for children or teenagers. One room, in particular, caught our attention because the walls were covered in graffiti-style art and cartoon characters. The only one I can clearly remember was Kenny from South Park, but it didn't look like something people like us had done. It felt like it was from the building's previous inhabitants. Anyway, it was a creepy place, but that kind of gave it its charm, so we started hanging out there more often. One day, one of my friends suggested we try a Ouija board. Being young and foolish, we all agreed. We made our own board using paper with the letters written on it, a glass tumbler, and a Monopoly board turned upside down for that professional touch. We set it up in one of the upstairs rooms, lit a few candles for light, and all put a finger on the glass. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but then, the glass started moving. It seemed to indicate that it was going to hurt one of my friends, let's call him Rob. We were all freaked out at that point, so we stopped immediately. We burned the letters we had made and smashed the glass. I had heard that you're supposed to do that, although I'm not sure where I'd learned it from. Then, we ran out of the building as fast as we could. On the way out, one of my other friends, Stephen, admitted that it had been him moving the glass. We all had a laugh about it, but just as we were nearing the bottom of the stairs, we heard heavy footsteps from upstairs. It sounded like someone running, and it was getting closer to us. At that point, we bolted out of the building and across the field, and I never went back after that. Later that day, most of my friends had gone home, but 4 of us were still hanging out, Rob and Stephen included. We went to Rob's house because he had to go home for dinner, but he said we could wait in his garage. After some time, we decided to try the Ouija board again. I still don't know why we did, considering what had happened earlier. This time, we supposedly contacted the spirit of a young girl who had been murdered. As we asked questions, the glass started moving faster and faster, and I thought it was Stephen messing with us again. But he looked just as shocked as the rest of us. Then, the glass suddenly got very hot, and when I pulled my finger away, I had a painful blister on it that lasted for 3 days. Neither Rob nor Stephen felt the glass get hot, and they both swore they hadn't been moving it. What was strange was that the heat wasn't gradual, it was instant. There was no slow build-up. The glass just became unbearably hot out of nowhere. To this day, I'm not in contact with any of those friends, but both Rob and Stephen still swear that they didn't move the glass and didn't experience the heat. This next story isn't about me, but it was something my mother told me, and while I can't confirm whether it's true, I know my mother wouldn't make something like this up. It's a story she was told about her father. He and a group of his friends were getting drunk one night in a graveyard, of all places, and decided to try a Ouija board. At some point during the session, they must have offended something because the glass shattered. One of the pieces of glass got lodged in one of the men. I won't go into details, as I'm mindful of the age limit, and he died right there in the graveyard. To be honest, this story sounds a little far-fetched to me. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but it feels more like one of those cautionary tales that adults tell to scare kids away from doing something dangerous. Still, I thought I'd share it, and let others make up their own minds. Hopefully, my stories about Ouija boards will deter some people from trying them out, because they're definitely not toys that should be messed with for a laugh. Throughout my life, I've had many pets, but I never considered the possibility of being haunted by one until I moved in with my now ex-girlfriend. She had a pure white German Shepherd that I had met a few times before we were together, but sadly, she passed away. After we started living together, we bought a pool table, and soon after, we began noticing white dog hairs on the table. The strange thing was, we couldn't figure out how they got there. The only other pet we had was a black toy poodle. Eventually, whenever we found one of those white dog hairs, we'd casually say, "Hello," to the German Shepherd, as though acknowledging her presence. About a year ago, the black toy poodle, who was 17 years old, had a major seizure. It happened around 2:30 in the morning, and since neither of us drove and we didn't have any friends nearby to help, we were unable to get her to a vet. After trying for what felt like forever to help her recover, I had to make the painful decision to end her suffering. It still haunts me, and it was by far the hardest thing I have ever had to do. I hope I never have to face something like that again. The very next day, as I was talking about how guilty I felt, I suddenly heard a tapping noise upstairs, an unmistakable sound. It was the sound of our toy poodle trying to jump up onto the bed, a noise she used to make often because she was so small and would dance around trying to get on. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped, and I went upstairs to check, but there was nothing there. I went back downstairs, and soon after, I heard the distinct noise of her jumping down off the bed. It was the same sound she made every time she would get down, and I knew there was no mistaking it. Anyone with pets knows the unique sounds their animals make. No other noise could have mimicked it. I like to think that she came back, even for just a moment, to reassure me that I didn't have to feel guilty, that I had helped her. While I know that doesn't change anything, it gave me some comfort to believe that she was telling me everything was okay. Another pet that came to visit me was my cat, Victor. He was a gray and white Maine Coon with some health problems from a young age. He had to keep his head tipped to the right all the time, and he had bad balance. He passed away in his sleep from a heart attack just a few days after his first birthday, and I was devastated. I held him for hours, not wanting to let go. For about a week after his death, I could feel his presence. I would hear the bell on his collar, and I'd hear that strange sound he made, a half-purr before he would cry. I could also feel him around. Every time I went up the stairs, I would see him sitting there. I don't mean I saw him with my eyes, but I just knew he was there, as though he was still sitting there even though I couldn't see him. It's hard to explain. Imagine if someone you know became invisible, but all your other senses still told you they were there. That's as close as I can describe it. After about a week, those sensations stopped, and I stopped hearing the bell or feeling his presence. I don't know if it was truly him still hanging around or if I was just so grief-stricken that my mind was trying to comfort me. Either way, I like to believe it was him saying goodbye, or maybe just lingering for a little while before moving on to explore new places. When I was 15, I was sitting in class with some friends when one of them started talking about an abandoned house near a plot of land with a farmhouse. She referred to it as the haunted house, but I suppose most people would assume any old, run-down house was haunted. She didn't mention any paranormal activity, just that she and some friends had explored the house and walked around the ruins until they got bored and left. I decided I wanted to check it out for myself with a few friends that night. It was a spooky place to be, mainly because we were unsure if someone else, like a homeless person or another group of kids, was already inside. Nothing much happened that night, apart from us being freaked out by a wasp nest we found. But one thing did happen that I brushed off as nothing at the time. I was about to take a picture of my friend standing next to a fireplace when a yellow/green circle appeared in the photo, zoomed upwards, and disappeared. It could have been a camera malfunction or a bug, but it was definitely strange. A few days later, I mentioned the house to another friend who didn't know about it. She was intrigued and wanted to check it out, so we decided to go that evening. I didn't believe it was haunted, but I knew some people talked about a man named Red John, as that name had been spray-painted on a plank of wood near the house. I figured it was just an old, abandoned house, decorated in a way that made it feel eerie, more of a 50s divided by 60s divided by 70s vibe, with peeling wallpaper and a lot of damage. We brought our phones to take pictures and record videos, just to see if anything happened. I didn't tell her about the yellow/green circle I had seen earlier, as I thought there were too many natural explanations for it. We arrived at the house around 6 or 7 p.m. and explored for a while. My friend went upstairs, but I stayed downstairs because the stairs didn't look very stable. I went into the room with the fireplace, and after a bit, my friend came back downstairs to join me. We sat on a windowsill and started recording on our phones. Then, my friend suggested we try talking to the ghost to see if anything happened, so we started asking questions like, "Is there anyone here? If you want us to stay, can you knock? If you want us to go, can you knock? Can you scream for us?" We were getting restless because nothing was happening, so I mouthed to my friend that I was going to hit the wall to show our friends that something had occurred. I hit the wall, and then we stopped filming. What happened next is probably the biggest regret of my life. As we listened back to the recording, we heard faint, frantic knocking sounds. We also heard a scraping noise, like something dragging on wood. When I heard that, I immediately said we needed to leave, and we ran to the nearby park. We sat on a bench and shakily listened to the recording again. What we heard was terrifying for a 15-year-old to hear. When we asked the ghost to knock if it wanted us to stay, it knocked about 10 times quickly. When we asked it to stop knocking if it wanted us to leave, the knocking stopped entirely, followed by the scraping sound. Then, when we asked it to scream, there was a faint noise that sounded like a car accelerating. While that could have a natural explanation, we heard none of this while we were recording. At the time, we didn't hear anything at all. The noises only appeared on the playback. We didn't show the video to anyone, because at the end of the recording, we faked a banging sound, and no one would believe it was real. Also, the video didn't show us very clearly. We were just pointing the phone in random directions to see if we could capture something. Later, I showed the video to my sister, and she suggested that it might have been some kids playing a trick on us. I would have agreed with her, but at the time, we heard absolutely nothing while we were there, and that never made sense to me. Was it paranormal? I still don't know. The land the house was on has now been bought, and a new house has been built in the garden. The haunted house is still standing, but I'm sure the new owners will tear it down soon, so I'll never be able to revisit it. A little over 10 years ago, I lived in a maisonette with my ex-girlfriend, a visual artist, and her pet cat. My ex never really talked about the supernatural back then, but I knew from before we met that she had an experience late one night while cycling over a bridge that terrified her. Because of that, I was careful not to bring up anything related to the supernatural around her. The incident that I want to share happened one Sunday afternoon while we were sitting together on the lounge room sofa. My ex was next to me, absorbed in her sketching. She was really into drawing and painting at the time. I was just staring at the blank TV screen, deep in thought. The TV was off, but I was in one of those reflective moods, simply lost in my own mind. After a few moments, I noticed something strange. Just beneath the television, the glass door to the cabinet slowly swung open all by itself. I watched in amazement as it moved back as far as it could, completely silently. My first thought was for my ex. I knew if she saw this, she'd probably scream. Luckily, she didn't notice it. She was still focused on her large sketchbook, oblivious to what was happening. I sighed in relief and stayed still, my mind racing, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. How could the glass door open on its own like that? I knew the cabinet had a magnetic lock, and whenever the door made contact with it, I could hear an audible click. There was also a click when the door was released, but in this case, there was nothing. It was complete silence. The door moved slowly and deliberately, without any sound at all. I casually glanced over my shoulder at the windows, pretending to look outside so as not to disturb my ex. The windows were shut. There was no draft, no breeze, nothing. I then stood up slowly and walked over to the cabinet. I pretended to browse for a video, all while scanning the room for her cat, wanting to make sure it wasn't the cat behind the television. She wasn't. The cat wasn't in the room at all. I walked back to the sofa and sat down again, quietly. My mind was racing, trying to come up with any rational explanation for what I had just witnessed. A week later, I had almost forgotten about the incident when I was on the phone with my mother. We were catching up, as we usually did, since I lived in a different part of the world and didn't visit often. Most of the updates I got about the family came from her. During the conversation, she casually mentioned that she had recently visited a clairvoyant, someone she liked to see every now and then. The clairvoyant had told her that my grandfather had visited recently. He'd come to see me. My grandfather passed away in 1994. Suddenly, my heart began to race as I recalled the incident from the week before. Could it have been my grandfather who had caught my attention by opening the glass door? Was he being careful not to disturb my ex, making sure it was just me who noticed? All rational explanations seemed to vanish as the news from the clairvoyant sank in. The possibility that it had been my grandfather, watching over me in that quiet moment, made everything else feel like it no longer mattered. I know my story might sound cliché, but I assure you, everything I've experienced is completely true. I've had paranormal encounters since I was a baby. My earliest memory was seeing my granddad shortly after he passed away. My mum would find me in my cot, babbling to the air and reaching out as if asking to be picked up. I would say it was my granddad. She initially dismissed it, but one day she found me crying, saying my granddad had come into the room with two big monsters. My granddad was Italian and had two mastiffs that he loved dearly. I was only about a year old at the time. But the last experience I had, I don't ever want to go through again. When I was 14, almost 15, I was in a really bad place. I was extremely unhappy, crying myself to sleep most nights. It was then that I started to see a dark figure. At first, I would just notice it out of the corner of my eye, when I came out of my room, or when I passed the bathroom, or when I was alone in the kitchen. But whenever I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, maybe because I was feeling so low. I spent most of my time alone in my room, but then I began to notice something strange. It would get extremely cold in my room. It got so cold that I could see my breath in the air, and it always felt like I was being watched. I still tried to dismiss it, making excuses in my head. But then things started moving in my room. I'd place something in a specific spot, and when I came back, it would be moved. At night, I'd hear creaking noises from the floorboards. My bed was in the middle of the room, and I'd hear the floorboards creak on one side, then a few seconds later, they'd creak on the other side. This happened every night. Eventually, it progressed to hearing indistinct whispers, but none of this really frightened me at first. Then, one day, I forgot a folder for school and had to run back home to grab it. My mum was waiting in the car, so I was in the house alone. I bent down to pick up the folder, which was below a shelf full of my cuddly toys. As I reached for it, I felt something grab my shoulder and push me over. I almost hit my head on the sharp corner of the shelf. I didn't touch it. I swear it was the force of something else pushing me. When I hit the floor, I was in shock, and then all my cuddly toys fell off the shelf. I was terrified, but I didn't tell my mom. I didn't think she'd believe me. After that, I rarely had a peaceful night's sleep, with the whispers, coldness, and creaking floorboards keeping me up. A few weeks later, my mom called me while I was out. She said she thought there was something in my room. I asked how she knew, and she told me that she'd seen something in my large mirror. It was a young boy, maybe 8 years old. My room had just been redecorated, and the house was from the 1940s, so my mum thought the renovation might have stirred up something dormant. My mum is a very spiritual person, so it didn't surprise me when she said she went into my room to tell the spirit to leave. She told it that if it didn't go, she'd get our priest to bless the room. I was out again when she called me, sounding really rattled. She said that after she had told the spirit to leave and shut the door opened by itself and slammed shut. That really scared her, but after that, I didn't experience any more disturbances. Since then, though, I still feel like I'm being watched when I'm in my room. It hasn't happened as much since I left for university in Portsmouth, but I still get that unsettling feeling sometimes. When I was about 3 years old, I was an only child until I turned 11, and I was very content spending time on my own. My bedroom was small, so I often played on the landing. My mum would often find me talking to what seemed like no one. At first, she thought I was just talking to myself, but there was something strange about it. I was 3 years old, yet I would talk about things that a child my age shouldn't even be able to understand, things like answering questions from someone or something invisible. As my vocabulary grew, I started saying things like, "I'm going to talk to the lady on the landing now." I would go upstairs, stand by the wall, and talk to it. From then on, I referred to her as the lady on the landing. She seemed to be a teacher who worked in the house, and I would talk to her every day. I remember feeling a mix of affection and slight fear. She seemed friendly, but also stern. Eventually, I stopped mentioning her, and the strange experiences seemed to fade. That is, until I was about 6 years old. I could never walk down the stairs without having my back against the wall. It always felt like something was there. The same feeling hit when I was sitting on the toilet, as the stairs and the bathroom were near each other. It was as though something was watching me from the top of the stairs. There was also a light in that hallway that never worked, no matter how many times we replaced the bulb. An electrician came to check it, but he couldn't explain why it wouldn't work. When I was 8, my grandfather became very ill with lung cancer and was hospitalized. During this time, my dad came down with a severe case of salmonella but didn't want to worry the family, so he stayed at home. I ended up sharing my mum's bed since my dad was in my bedroom. On the very first night, I woke up exactly at 3:32 a.m. feeling an intense chill. I've never felt such a coldness in my life. As I lay there, I could sense a presence on the landing. I could hear heavy breathing, but I wasn't sure if it was my dad. What made me feel most uneasy was the breathing itself. It was deep and labored. I sat up in bed, staring at the bedroom door, when suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the doorway. I convinced myself it was just the dressing gown hanging on the door, but as I looked closer, it seemed to hover in front of it, almost as if floating. It bobbed up and down slightly. Terrified, I hid under the duvet, trying to stay quiet so as not to wake my mum, who was fast asleep. But then, I felt the figure move toward me. It walked across the room, around the bed, and eventually, I felt it sitting at the foot of my legs. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move or push it away. Then it stood up, and I could feel it next to my head, as though it was staring at me. I finally managed to free myself from the weight of it, and in my panic, I kicked my mum hard in the back. She woke up, and before I could explain, she turned to me and said, "Is there someone in the room?" She could feel my heart pounding so hard it was making the bed shake slightly. She instantly knew there was something in the room, but neither of us dared to get out of bed to see what it was. When I looked at the door, I briefly saw the figure, and its eyes, bright orange, glowing, with no other features, stared right at me. The figure was taller than the door, and it had no clear shape or body, just a dark, looming presence. Every Monday morning for the next 6 or 7 weeks, the same thing would happen at the same time. I remember it happening once in my own room, but I was so scared that I hid under the duvet and didn't look. I just knew it was there. I don't know if the experiences were connected, but that house had many strange occurrences. Nearly every family member and friend had their own ghost stories to tell. People would hear crying in the house, thinking it was my mum, but when they went upstairs, no one was there. One night, my mum was putting on makeup in the bathroom while my dad took me to my grandma's house. She thought she heard someone walking on the landing, so she locked herself in the bathroom, thinking there was a burglar. My dad came home later and found nothing. One night, I was sitting on my bed playing with a toy when I heard the bathroom lights switch on. The cord for the switch was swinging and banging against the wall. Then I heard shuffling feet, like someone dragging their feet on a slippery floor. I screamed for my mom, and she ran up with a fire poker, having heard something too. We moved out of the house soon after, as it became too much for my mom and me. But I never felt the same sense of peace until I left. I stopped feeling like I had to look over my shoulder all the time. Nothing of this magnitude happened again. However, recently, I've started feeling like I'm being watched again. Now, as a student at university, I have the typical student sleep schedule, nocturnal, staying up late when everyone else is asleep. It's become common for me to wake up at 3 a.m. and go downstairs to get a drink. I never go into the lounge, but I've noticed the TV on a few times. When I pass by, the screen is glowing black, and when I stand and watch, it turns off. What's even stranger is that the TV doesn't make the usual startup sound. It just turns on without any noise. It only happens when I'm upstairs, and no one else in the house has seen it happen. Another odd thing is the lights. Whenever I switch on the kitchen, hallway, or landing light when I'm home alone, the fuse for the lights blows. It's something that's only happened when I'm alone, and no one else in the house has ever had the same issue. The most unsettling thing happened recently. I was sitting on the front doorstep, smoking, when an overwhelming feeling took over me. It was so intense, I couldn't breathe, and I suddenly felt like everything was terrible. My mind was filled with horrible thoughts, ones I don't normally have. I ended up vomiting, unable to remember what I'd seen in my mind. The moment the feeling passed, I couldn't recall the images at all. I thought it was all over until my younger brother came into my room and presented me with a selection of cards. He's always doing card tricks, but this time, he had cards I had never seen before. He asked me to pick a card, then choose top or bottom. I said, "Top," and he read the words on the card. "You're in danger, excess, and solitude." "57 years ago, in the countryside of County Sligo, Republic of Ireland, my mother, Maura, was on holiday with her 5-year-old sister, Colette. They were visiting the Lisadell estate, which has been tended by our family for generations, and continues to be cared for by us today. Maura was 14 years old at the time, and the year was 1962. They were staying in my aunt's cottage, which was a traditional Irish country home. The cottage had a living area and kitchen combined, which they called the parlor, and 2 bedrooms on opposite ends. The regular occupants were Maura's aunt and uncle, Maggie and Tim, who lived in 1 bedroom, leaving the other room empty for most of the year. Maura and Colette's mother, Maureen, had left them in the care of Maggie and Tim while she visited family in the countryside. So, Maura and Colette slept in the spare room, which had a bed settee. This was an old-style couch that could be turned into a bed for 3 people. The room was painted in an old, dull white and always had a musty, damp smell, which Maura later called unlived in. The room was also filled with strange pictures and dolls that Maggie thought were beautiful, but Maura found unsettling. One feature of the room that stood out were the pillows on the bed settee. They were stuffed with newspaper, which was common when money was tight. This made the pillows rustle or crunch when moved. Maura and Colette, being used to normal pillows, found this funny. The strange event happened around 9 or 10 p.m. Maura and Colette were lying on the bed settee, talking and laughing quietly so they wouldn't get caught by their aunt, who was strict about bedtime. Then, they heard the door to the bedroom creak open. They instantly became silent, pretending to be asleep, and kept their eyes shut tightly. Next, they heard the sound of heavy boots walking on the wooden floor. The footsteps grew louder, and Maura thought they were approaching the bed. The footsteps stopped beside her side of the bed. Maura then felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Then she heard the sound of the pillow rustling. She felt the pillow sink, as though someone had leaned over her to look at Colette, who was on the other side of the bed against the wall. The pressure on the pillow lasted for a while before it suddenly released. The footsteps then retreated, moving away from the bed and toward the door. The door creaked shut, and everything went quiet. Maura didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just her aunt checking on them. The next morning, she asked Maggie if she had been in their room during the night. Maggie replied, "Buck, your head's away. Me and Tim were asleep the whole night. We didn't get up at all." Tim confirmed this too. So, what really happened that night? Could it have been Maggie playing a prank? That seemed unlikely, as Maggie was stern and not the type to joke around. Could she have been forgetful and entered the room without realizing? Perhaps. Or maybe it was something else. Perhaps the long history of Lisadell Estate and its cottages harbors spirits that wonder why strange children are sleeping in their home. In 2006, I visited the same cottage. It had been renovated, and several extensions had been added to the original building. The room where the strange event had occurred had been redecorated and was now home to Maggie and Tim's daughter, Andrea, and her family. Andrea soon began to experience odd occurrences in the room. She reported feeling an unexplainable chill, as though it were a frosty morning, even in the middle of August. The room also retained that musty, unlived-in smell, despite the years of redecoration. I know this because I felt it myself. Andrea had never been told about the history of the room. Perhaps that was for the best. When I was 6 years old, something happened that has stayed with me to this day. I don't claim to be an expert in the paranormal, nor do I fully understand what happened, but the experience left me confused and unsettled. I wasn't a believer then, and I'm still not a firm one, but what I experienced back in 2001 has always stuck with me. I grew up in a house in Birmingham, England. It was the house I was born in and still live in today, although I plan on moving into an apartment in a few years. The house was built shortly before I was born, and it had never been a residential property before this development. The land had once housed a public house named the King Charles. A bit of research revealed that the area had been known for disputes, and there had been incidents involving firearms and narcotics in the past. The house itself is structured in a simple way. A small hallway leads to a tiny kitchen on the left, a staircase to the right, and a large lounge directly ahead. Upstairs, there's a large bedroom on the right, a small bedroom straight ahead, and at the far end of the upstairs balcony, a small bathroom. At the time of the incident, I shared the large bedroom with my mother, with my half of the room positioned directly above the rear entrance to the house, which was situated inside the lounge. This rear door would become important. The house sits in the center of a row of homes, elevated by about 8 steps on a hill. It is the most prominent house in the row, and there are 13 homes in total, with the last one labeled 12A. Now, about the night. I remember it vividly. I was sitting by the rear door, playing with some toys scattered around me, probably only about 4 feet from the door. I looked up and saw my mother and her boyfriend sitting on the couch, engrossed in the television. I began to feel uneasy, a growing discomfort around the door. I felt a sense of panic and unease, though I couldn't quite explain why. The darkness outside seemed strange, but not in the way it normally did. There was a dim spotlight outside, on a timer that would flicker on for about 30 seconds and then remain off for a few minutes. As I looked through the glass of the door, something about the darkness outside felt off, as if something didn't belong there. It was like looking at an old photograph. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I shuffled closer to the door and stared out into the garden. Now I understand that a child's imagination can often exaggerate things, but what I saw has never made sense to me, even all these years later. I saw a shadow, though not just any shadow. It looked like a reflection of myself, but it was shorter, chunkier, and oddly positioned. Despite me kneeling upright, the shadow was sitting, almost ape-like in its posture. The shape looked threatening, but the real thing that caught me off guard was the feeling that came with it. It wasn't an aggressive presence, but something more like companionship. It felt strangely friendly. Terrified, I ran to my mom and told her about the shadow at the door, but she brushed me off, thinking I was just playing around. I returned to the door, looked through the glass again, and this time, the shadow had changed position. It was now kneeling on one knee, its weight shifted onto its right arm, and its left hand was pointed directly at the glass. I was terrified, but there was something oddly comforting about it. The shadow seemed to acknowledge me, and before I knew it, I had placed my hand against the glass. In response, the shadow mirrored my action, pressing its hand against the glass almost instantly. The moment our hands made contact, time seemed to freeze. I can't describe it fully, but everything around me slowed, as if the world had stopped moving. A sharp pain shot through my limbs, starting at my hand and traveling up my arm. My heart raced, and I felt frozen in place, as though my body had become paralyzed. For a moment I couldn't move. I felt mentally drained and detached, as if I wasn't even fully aware of what was happening. I tried to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. It felt like I was stuck in place, unable to break free. The pain lingered, then gradually faded, and when I finally regained full control of my body, I looked back at the door. The shadow was gone. Over the past 2 weeks, I've noticed a significant increase in strange occurrences around my home. Little things, like odd sounds, shadows, and objects moving, have started happening more frequently. I'm hoping someone can help me understand what might be causing this activity. My first experience occurred about 8 days ago. I came up the stairs to use the bathroom and noticed that all the lights on the landing were switched on. My family and I had been downstairs watching a movie with all the lights off, so I was confused as to how they had been turned on, especially the manual bedroom lights, which were on too. I turned all the lights off and went to the bathroom. While washing my hands, I looked at the reflection in the tap, which showed the first few steps of the stairs. That's when I saw it, a shadow in the shape of a man, standing on the stairs, facing the bathroom door. I froze, staring at it for a few minutes before it seemed to fade away. I quickly rushed downstairs, feeling unnerved. The second experience happened the following night. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I noticed that my DVD player kept turning on and off. The power button would light up and change color when the DVD player turned on or off. I thought it might be receiving signals from a nearby house or my brother's room, but the DVD player could only be turned on and off manually or with the controller, which was on top of a shelf across the room. After a while, I got frustrated because I couldn't sleep, so I said, "Go away, I'm trying to sleep." Immediately, the DVD player turned off and didn't turn back on for the rest of the night. However, the room grew noticeably cold for a few seconds, even though the heating was on. I couldn't see my breath, but the temperature change was very noticeable. The third set of experiences happened over the following days, and they seemed to be small noises or strange occurrences. One of the earliest was when my dad was working late and sleeping during the day. I went upstairs to my room to get something, and I heard a strange grunt, almost like a pig's snort, but much louder. I went to check on my dad, and he was sound asleep, with no sign that he had made the noise. No one downstairs had heard it either. A few days later, I was the only one awake in the house. It was quite early, and I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs to make myself some cereal. While getting the milk out of the fridge, I shut the fridge door and began using the milk. Suddenly, I heard the familiar hum of a fridge door being opened, something you can only hear when the door is open. I turned to see both the top and bottom fridge doors open about 4 inches. I was shocked, because I know the fridge doors have strong magnets, and you have to give them a firm yank to open them. As I stood there confused, I heard a quiet giggle, like the sound of a small child, maybe around 6 years old, right behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I tested the fridge doors and confirmed they were difficult to open, making it impossible for them to have opened on their own. There have also been a few other odd occurrences. I've heard shushing whispers coming from my parents' room when no one was in there, and I've found my books moved to strange places, like inside a cereal box, without anyone claiming to have touched them. Just about half an hour ago, my mum left the room, and I heard another giggle. It really freaked me out because I don't have any sisters. At the same time, I saw the computer chair, a large black leather one, move slightly towards the door, as though someone had pushed it. I could clearly see the movement because the room has white walls, which made the chair stand out. I asked my mum if she'd heard anything, but she said no. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Before my parents extended our first home, it was a modest 2-bedroom bungalow. Both bedrooms were at the rear of the house, with my parents in one and my older sister and I sharing the other. As a young child, I never thought much about sleeping on the ground floor, even though there was garden access from both the front road and a cul-de-sac at the back. I never feared sleeping there, until one night, when something happened that I couldn't explain. My bed was positioned by the window, and my sister's bed was tucked into a recess in the wall. According to my parents, I never had trouble sleeping, but one night, one of many, I found myself drawn to 2 people I had never seen before. Standing in front of me in my room were a man and a woman, either of whom seemed to acknowledge my presence, nor did they show any interest in me or their surroundings. They were simply going about their routine. Now, I grew up in the 70s, a time when fashion wasn't exactly something I paid attention to. But even at such a young age, I think I was about 3 or 4, I thought the way these 2 were dressed was odd. The woman wore the same type of dark dress every night. It was long, black, and hung loosely down to her ankles. Her dark brown hair was neatly pulled into a bun. She was taller and thinner than my mother, with sharp features that made her seem older. The man, too, was much older than my parents. He wore a brown/beige suit with a shirt and tie, and had fair, receding hair and a mustache that stretched down to his cheeks. The first time they appeared in my room, I was sitting up in bed, curious about who they were and what they were doing in my bedroom. I shuffled to the end of the bed and sat there, watching them. They noticed me, but neither seemed alarmed by my presence. They simply went on with what they were doing, paying no mind to me. At the foot of my bed, there was a 2-door teak wardrobe, and to my astonishment, there was also a large black stove beside it. As a child, I thought it was strange for a cooking appliance to be in my bedroom, and I was sure either of my parents had placed it there. We didn't even own a black stove. The only people I knew who had one were my great-grandparents, who lived in a cottage 2 miles away. Their stove had been the same for years. Each night, after the light in the bedroom was turned off, the man and woman, along with the black stove, would appear, and every time, I would sit at the end of the bed, watching them. On a few occasions, my sister would ask me who I was talking to, but she never seemed alarmed when I told her about the man and woman in our bedroom. She'd either tell me to get back in bed or fall asleep without a second thought. The couple didn't often engage me in conversation. I couldn't always understand what they were talking about, and I found their adult conversations boring. However, I remember exchanging a few words like hello and good night, and sometimes they would mention my parents, saying things like, "We are your mother and father." But I never felt that they were my real parents, because I knew my actual parents were in the next room. What stood out to me most was that they never showed any physical affection for each other. I found this strangely comforting, as I felt my own parents' love for me was always abundant, and I took solace in the belief that these 2 weren't my parents. I'm not sure how long this went on, but at some point, I began to feel uncomfortable. It wasn't just the fact that they repeatedly claimed to be my parents. It was more like an uneasy sixth sense telling me something was off about their presence. Even at such a young age, I felt that it wasn't safe to be around them anymore. One night, after the light had been switched off and they appeared again, I sat back on my bed, feeling a sudden surge of anxiety. They were standing closer than usual, and I could feel my heart pounding. I didn't like being around them anymore, but didn't know how to make them leave without causing trouble. The woman stepped closer to me, her left arm outstretched, as if to touch me. I recoiled, feeling a cold shiver run through me. She spoke, and her words sent a chill through my entire body. she said. "Because we are your mother and father, you have to come with us. We are taking you, tonight." Panicked, I jumped out of bed, brushing past them, and scrambled to my sister's bed, making sure to sleep between her and the wall. Trembling, I peeked over the edge of the sheets, expecting to see their menacing faces or feel their arms reaching out to drag me away. But the room was silent. The couple and their black stove had disappeared, and the only furniture in the room was what belonged to my parents. The next morning, something didn't make sense. I noticed a strange stain on my pillow. Our bedding was a bright purplish color, but where my head would have rested, there was a large white mark, as if some sort of detergent had been poured onto the pillowcase, discoloring the fabric. It hadn't been there before I went to bed, and my parents never left dangerous household substances around for us to play with. My mother never dressed my bed in those sheets again, but she kept the pillowcase, tearing it up to use for cleaning rags. I asked her about it years later, but she couldn't explain the stain. It was as much of a mystery to her as it was to me. And to this day, I still wonder, who were the man and woman who visited me, and why were they there? I can't remember exactly how old I was when this happened, but I would estimate I was between 10 and 12 years old. My parents had bought me a dog, Dasha, in 1984, and he quickly became my best friend. I'd take him for walks before school and couldn't wait for the end of the day, so I could run around and play with him. Before more houses were built in the area, there were large playing fields, which were once used for mining. When I was 8 years old, I injured myself pretty badly while playing on the old coal humps. But that didn't stop me from using the area as my playground. One summer evening, after running around with Dasha, I was making my way home. The fields weren't too far from our house. I could actually see the back of my house from the fields. However, to get home, I had to cross the main road, which was the main route before the bypass was built, and take a side street leading to the street where my parents' house was. It wasn't too quiet that evening. Cars were driving along the main road, and a few people were tending to their gardens. I walked a few yards down the road until I stopped on the grass verge opposite the side street, waiting for a gap in traffic so I could cross. I don't know why, but as I stood there, I suddenly heard a whisper in my ear. "Watch out for the next car that comes over the brow of the hill." I was completely stunned. No one was standing next to me, and I instinctively knew that this was a message. The word brow wasn't something I used at that age to describe a dip in the road. There were plenty of other cars passing by, so I couldn't understand why I was being warned about a car that hadn't even appeared yet. I stepped back off the grass verge, moving closer to the front garden walls of the houses nearby, and watched the road carefully. A brief gap in the traffic came, and that's when I saw it. The car I'd been warned about. I kept Dasha on a tight leash, close to me, hoping he'd protect me if something went wrong. I didn't take my eyes off the car as it approached, praying it would pass without incident. But it didn't. The middle-aged male driver saw me and slowed down. His glare was strange and made me feel uneasy. My heart raced, and my legs started to tremble. Was this ghostly warning right? Was there something off about this driver that I needed to be aware of? The driver pulled over to the curb, right next to me. He leaned across and flung open his passenger door, his arm outstretched as if to grab me. Panic flooded me, but luckily the whisper had given me a head start. Since I wasn't standing on the grass verge anymore, I was already in a position to run. I spotted a car parked in one of the driveways a few houses down, and decided to make a break for it. I don't know how my hand didn't break the glass when I banged on the door, but I remember wondering if anyone would answer. It felt like an eternity before I heard voices from inside. I could hear a family talking from what sounded like the bathroom area. I squeezed through the small gap between the outer porch and the boundary wall and banged on the bathroom window. I was screaming, "Help me, please! A man is trying to get me in his car!" A man and a woman rushed to my aid, clearly confused about why a strange young girl was screaming for help in their garden. I was sobbing and trembling by this point. The man of the house looked furious at what I was telling them, and immediately ran to the front of the house. The man in the car was still sitting there with the passenger door open, expecting me to eventually walk into his grasp. The man from the house got angrier, and I remember him swearing loudly. The driver quickly slammed the car door and sped away. The woman kindly walked me home and explained everything to my terrified parents. I was so grateful to the couple who had helped me and kept me safe, but I felt even more thankful to the ghostly voice that had warned me about the car, before it had even appeared. If not for that warning, I might have walked straight into danger. I'm Luke from the UK, and I live in a quiet area about 13 miles from Derby. Over the years, I've had a few strange experiences at my house that I've never been able to fully explain. I've always been somewhat skeptical about ghosts, assuming they were things other people experienced. But after reading some of the stories shared here, I began to wonder if what I've witnessed could actually be something paranormal. I'll start with the events from this year, and if people find this story interesting, I'll share some other experiences from 2007 and 2008 when I have time. I'm not sure if my house is haunted or if the things I've experienced are just strange coincidences. I'm open to the idea of the paranormal, but I still remain uncertain. The first incident I'll talk about happened in the early hours of January 2nd, 2012. Before I get into the details, let me briefly describe the layout of my house. I live on a lane with 6 cottages, just up from the main road. The houses are quite old, possibly dating back to World War II. My house is the 4th on the row. We have a small porch at the front, with a large door entering into the living room. The living room itself is very spacious and was originally 2 rooms divided by a large wall, though the place where the wall used to be is still visible. The living room has 2 large windows. One looks out onto the front garden, and the other looks onto the backyard. There are cream-colored blinds over these windows that are always pulled down at night. Next to the back window is a door leading into the kitchen, a small room with a door that leads to the backyard. Upstairs, there's a landing, my parents' bedroom, and mine and my brother's room, which we share. The bathroom is above the kitchen, and the attic, where we store things like Christmas decorations, is accessed from the landing. So, now that you have a rough idea of the layout, let me explain what happened. It was around 2 a.m. on January 2nd, 2012. I was lying in bed, reading the books I'd received for Christmas, while my brother was fast asleep in the bunk bed above me. I was staying up late, trying to make the most of my time before returning to college in a couple of days. When I finished reading, I put my book down on the drawer next to me and placed my head torch beside it. I closed my eyes, and everything was silent. Everyone else was asleep, and I thought I was about to drift off too. Suddenly, I heard a loud and rapid banging noise. I immediately sat up in bed, and my dog, who was lying next to me, woke up and started barking loudly. This was when I knew I wasn't dreaming. The noise sounded like someone was hitting the glass on the kitchen door or window really hard. Both of these are double-glazed, and they make a loud noise when struck. The banging lasted for about 10 seconds, then stopped just as abruptly as it started. My dog settled down after a moment. I struggled to sleep that night, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what it could have been. Our backyard has a wooden gate, which is very loud when opened, and there's a 6-foot wall around the rest of the yard, so any intruders would have been easy to hear. Yet, no one had been in the yard that night, at least, not that I could explain. What's strange is that after the banging stopped, there was no sound of footsteps or anyone fleeing, just silence. The next morning, I told my parents and my brother what I had heard, but they all insisted they hadn't heard anything, not even the dog barking. For added context, in the summer of 2011, around July or August, my mum mentioned that she had heard banging from the backyard in the night, followed by the sound of my dog barking. She went to check on him, and he seemed shaken, but she didn't think much of it at the time. Then, a few months later, around October or November 2011, another strange thing happened. One evening, my family and I were in the living room watching TV, and my dog was acting strange. He was staring at the far side of the room, looking towards the kitchen door and the backyard. He wouldn't even go near that side of the room, which was odd. We all dismissed it at the time, but it definitely stuck with me. The next incident occurred in late July or early August 2012, just before our holiday to Ibiza. This time, I wasn't directly involved, but my brother was. He had gone to bed early for the night, and I was still up reading in my room. About 15 minutes later, my brother came upstairs looking shaken. I could tell something was wrong, so I asked him what had happened. He said that when he was downstairs, sitting on the furthest sofa from the backyard, he saw something strange. All the lights were off except for the TV, which illuminated the far side of the room. As he looked toward the backyard window, he saw the silhouette of a human figure through the blinds, facing the direction of the kitchen. Panicked, my brother immediately dropped to the floor, crept up, turned off the TV, and ran upstairs, glancing back to see if the figure was still there. It was. At first, I had doubts about his story, but I could tell he was genuinely frightened. I went over to the window and opened the curtains to check, but there was nothing there. Just as I was about to comment on how our dog hadn't barked, the dog let out a few protective barks, then fell silent. We were due to fly to Ibiza on August 29, 2012, and the night before we left, the same thing happened again. My brother, now anxious from the night before, had gone downstairs to watch TV again. He said he saw the same silhouette, only this time it was closer to the kitchen door, still not moving. I tried to reassure him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what he had seen was real. What bothered me the most was that it had appeared again, just before we were due to leave for our holiday. If it wasn't something paranormal, could it have been someone watching our house and waiting for us to leave? We returned home from our holiday last Wednesday, and so far everything has been quiet. No banging, no silhouettes, nothing unusual. I'm not sure what happened, but I can't ignore the feeling that something strange was going on. In 2010, my cousin and I went on vacation to Wales. My family had been visiting Wales almost every year for decades, but this was my first trip there, although I had traveled to England on my own before. Whenever they go, my family always visits Street Davids in southwest Wales, and they stay in a holiday cottage, which is where we stayed this time too. The cottage, which is about 500 years old, is one of the oldest buildings in St. David's. Before I tell you what happened, I need to describe the layout of the house so the rest of my story makes sense. The cottage is roughly L-shaped, 2 stories, and built from stone, with a stone floor on the ground level and wooden floors on the second story. A steep wooden staircase connects the 2 floors right at the corner of the L. The ground floor has a bedroom that occupies the short arm of the L. The upstairs, which occupies the long arm of the L, has 2 dedicated bedrooms and a small curtain nook that acts as a 3rd bedroom. Both floors have their own bathrooms. My cousin and I were the only ones staying there. She has bad knees, so we agreed she would take the ground floor bedroom, and I would take the upstairs one. Being a night owl, I was up late one evening, watching TV shows on YouTube in the upstairs bedroom. My cousin had already gone to bed, and the cottage was quiet and dark. My door was open, and everything seemed calm. Then, out of nowhere, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. At first, I thought it was my cousin coming upstairs, but I quickly dismissed that idea. The stairs would have been too hard on her knees, and there was no reason for her to come up. The cottage wasn't that big, and she could have just called me if she needed me. Also, I was pretty sure she was already asleep. I froze, trying to figure out what was happening. The footsteps continued, creaking across the 2nd floor until they stopped right at my bedroom door. I couldn't make sense of it, but nothing else happened, so after a few moments, I just went to bed, still a bit stunned. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep, but I couldn't quite shake the feeling of what had just happened. The next morning, I asked my cousin if she had come upstairs during the night, though I already knew the answer. since the footsteps had been so loud and clear. She said no, she hadn't, and she seemed surprised I was asking. So, I told her about what had happened. That's when she shared her own experience from the night before. She explained that, while lying in bed, somewhere between being awake and asleep, she had seen a man standing in the doorway of her bedroom. She described him as shortish and hobbit-looking, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. He spoke to her in Welsh, but the only word she remembered clearly sounded like tea. Since I had been learning a little Welsh, I knew that Thai, pronounced T, means house. She had chalked it up to a half-dream, thinking she had imagined it, until I told her about my own experience. Later that day, or maybe the next day, we were about to leave the cottage when we discovered that the keys were missing from their usual spot on the hook by the door. This was strange because we always left them there. We checked our pockets, checked every room, checked our bags, checked the yard, even inside the washing machine. We literally turned the place upside down for about an hour. Finally, my cousin said she would check her purse one more time. When we looked, the keys were sitting right on top of her purse. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say we had checked her purse at least 3 times, both separately and together. The keys were nowhere to be found. If they had been in there, we would have had to go past them to dig deeper into the bag. There's no way they had been there just minutes before. About 20 years ago, my husband attended a college at a former RAF base in Bircham Newton, located in the UK. The base had been converted into a construction training college, and although the house itself wasn't particularly old or spooky, my husband had a few strange experiences during his time there. One of the most famous stories from the college was about the haunted squash courts. The legend went that the ghosts of old RAF men had been seen and heard in the courts. One night, my husband and a group of friends were walking back to their rooms, and they had to pass the squash courts. The lights were off, and the place was locked up, but they distinctly heard the sound of a game of squash being played, the thwack of bats and the ball hitting the wall. They were all convinced that whatever they were hearing wasn't of this world, and they fled back to their rooms. There's a story that a group of pilots had planned to meet up at the courts after a bombing mission, but their plane never returned. Could the sounds they heard have been those same pilots finally getting their gain? On another occasion, 2 boys who were in the same class as my husband, and shared rooms in the old barracks, had an unsettling experience. One night, while they were in bed, they both suddenly woke up to see a man in RAF uniform walking straight through the window, and then through a wall. The window had once been a door, but the wall had been added when the barracks were converted into rooms for the students. Terrified, the boys fled the college that night and, shaken by the encounter, they never returned to the course. Fortunately, my husband never saw a ghost while he was there, but there were always stories from students about their strange experiences, and he often had the unsettling feeling of being watched. There are many reports online from others who have had similar experiences at Bircham Newton, and I believe paranormal investigators have visited the site as well. Another story involves my husband's mother. She was with the family, looking at new houses in a village, and they visited an old thatched cottage that was several hundred years old, with the intention of buying it. My husband would have been about 5 years old at the time, and as they wandered around the house, his mother noticed that he was talking to someone. She didn't recall exactly what he was saying, as she was distracted by the estate agent, but he was definitely speaking as though having a conversation, though there was no one else in the house. They continued their tour of the house, and it was completely empty, ready for the family to move in. After the visit, the family discussed the possibility of buying it on the way home. Then, my husband suddenly said, "We can't move into the house because there's already an old lady who lives there. She told me it's her house." This was odd because the house had been empty when they viewed it, and no one else was there apart from the family and the estate agent. Needless to say, they didn't buy the cottage. Now, a story from my mother, which is quite interesting. She's been the caretaker of the local village school for many years, and spends a lot of time there alone or with the cleaner. She's been involved with the school for nearly 40 years, having worked there herself. and my brothers and I all attended the school, so she's seen many staff come and go over the years. One summer evening, around 4:30 p.m., my mother was sitting outside with her colleague, who had also worked at the school for many years. They were having a coffee break on a bench outside the main school building, looking down at the school hall. The school was completely empty. No students or teachers were there, and the main building was locked as they were cleaning the nursery, which was in a separate building. As they chatted, my mother saw the head teacher walk across the hall through the large glass windows. She didn't say anything at first, but her colleague asked her, "Did you just see the head teacher?" My mother confirmed that she had, but there was one important detail. The head teacher had passed away 10 years earlier. When I asked her if the figure looked ghostly or transparent, she said no, it looked exactly like he did in life, and both of them saw him clearly. A few months later, my mother was locking up the school for the evening. The cleaner was waiting outside with one of the teachers, having a chat. They were standing outside the windows to the hall, and when my mother finished locking up, the teacher asked her, "Where did the man go who you were with?" My mother told her that she had been alone, and had just set the alarm. But the teacher insisted that she had seen a man following my mother across the school hall. After getting a description from the teacher, it turned out that the man she had seen was the old head teacher. My mother has never had a bad experience at the school, so she believes the spirit to be friendly. It seems like the head teacher is just going about his old routine, not causing any harm. About 10 years ago, when I was in my early 20s, I was staying with my new boyfriend and his friend, who shared a house in a small village in Bedfordshire. It wasn't an old, spooky house, just a regular semi-detached house, about 30 years old. I would usually stay on weekends, often arriving on a Friday afternoon, before the others returned from work in the evening. For a few months, nothing strange happened at all. The house seemed nice enough, quiet, comfortable, so I didn't think much of it. But then, things started happening. The first strange occurrence happened early one Saturday morning, on January 2nd, when my boyfriend and I were asleep in bed. The TV came on suddenly, and the light from the screen woke me up. My boyfriend didn't notice since he was facing away from the screen, but the light was bright enough to catch my attention, and there was no sound. I didn't think much of it at first, so I just pressed the standby button on the remote and rolled over to go back to sleep. But to my surprise, a few seconds later, the TV came back on. I turned it off again, but it came on again immediately. At this point, I thought the remote might be faulty, so I got out of bed and tried turning the TV off manually using the button on the TV itself. The TV was quite old, and the button was very clunky, so I made sure it was completely off with a definite clunk. I got back into bed, but a few minutes later, I heard the button click, and the TV came back on again. This absolutely freaked me out. I shook my boyfriend awake and told him what had happened, but he dismissed it as the old TV just being faulty. He said it was probably an electrical problem. I was still rattled, so I made him switch places with me, putting myself as far from the TV as possible, and we went back to sleep. The next night, something even stranger happened. Again, it was the early hours of the morning. My boyfriend and his friend were asleep, and I was in bed, when suddenly, the stereo downstairs came on at full volume. It was so loud that we both jumped out of bed in shock. My boyfriend and his friend went downstairs to check, and sure enough, the stereo had turned on by itself. They joked about having a poltergeist in the house, but we all just laughed it off and went back to bed. A few weeks later, I was at the house alone on a Friday afternoon. The guys were at work, and I had come straight from college. I decided to take a bath and relax before the evening. While I was in the bath, the house was completely silent. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the internal porch door downstairs open, followed by heavy footsteps running up the stairs, across the landing, and stopping right outside my bedroom door. It was so real and distinct that I thought it was my boyfriend or his friend, but when I called out, there was no answer. I called again, and still nothing. I sat in the bath for over an hour because I was too scared to open the door and check. Eventually, when my boyfriend came home, I told him what had happened. He reassured me it was probably just my imagination, but he did say that the main external front door was locked when he came in, and we were the only ones with keys. He said there couldn't have been anyone in the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the house with me. After that, we had a few other incidents with things going missing and turning up in odd places. The keys to the back door, which were always kept on a hook by the door, would sometimes appear on the other side of the room, for no apparent reason. My things, like my hairbrush and makeup, would be moved into the master bedroom, and if I was ever home alone, I would hear heavy footsteps running up the stairs. The final straw came about 8 months after I'd first started staying there. It was a Saturday night, and I was home alone. I don't remember why I was alone, but I do remember that it was November or December, and it was very dark outside. I was drying my hair in the bedroom, watching TV at the same time. Suddenly, the TV turned off. I didn't turn it off, and I didn't touch the remote. I didn't think much of it at first, but then, the hairdryer turned off too. I was getting more and more tense, but I continued drying my hair. Then, the stereo downstairs turned on again, loud as ever, and the bedroom light went out. At this point, I was absolutely terrified. I ran downstairs and out the front door, not knowing what else to do. I went to the next door neighbor's house, still shaken up, and told them that weird things were happening in the house. The woman who lived there sent her husband to get my phone and bag from the house. When he came back, he told me that everything in the house seemed normal. He even said the TV and the hairdryer were both on, and all the lights and the stereo were working fine, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary to him. Later, the neighbors told me that over the past few months, they had heard someone running up and down the stairs, doors banging, and the stereo coming on when it seemed like no one was home. After that night, I never went back inside the house. I called my boyfriend and told him what happened, and he came and picked me up, taking me back to my parents' house. He continued living in the house for another 6 months, but no other strange occurrences happened after that. For as long as I can remember, I've never felt safe. There's this constant feeling that I'm being watched, and I don't know if it's because of something that happened when I was younger or if it's just me. Most of the time, I hear bangs or scratches on the walls. I've always tried to brush it off, thinking it could just be the house settling or some other logical explanation. But there are times when I see things in the corner of my eye, shadows, masses, and shapes, that make me second-guess myself. One night, I was lying in bed, watching TV. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but that night, I was more restless than usual. I kept waking up every hour or so for no apparent reason, which left me feeling exhausted the next morning. At one point, I woke up and noticed that the TV was off. I reached over to turn on my bedside lamp, which was right beside my bed, and for some reason, I felt compelled to sit up and look ahead of me. I don't know why, but I just had this urge to do it. When I did, I saw a young girl standing in front of me. She had long brown hair, pale skin, and brown eyes. She was wearing a white hospital gown or nightdress, along with a short black cardigan, and she had a white bonnet on her head. Her appearance was odd, almost like a Victorian schoolgirl or a girl who had been in a hospital back in that era. I stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Neither of us moved. We just locked eyes. I glanced at the clock, which read 3:30 a.m., then looked back at her. She was still standing there. The whole situation felt surreal, but strangely, I didn't feel scared. It was almost like her presence felt normal. I got up and started walking towards her, but as I did, she slowly disappeared. I didn't feel any fear, which was unusual for me. I'm usually easily scared, but that night I didn't feel threatened at all. After she vanished, I simply went back to bed like nothing had happened. A few weeks later, something else happened that made me question things further. I had my earphones plugged into my laptop, listening to music earlier in the day. I had stopped the music but didn't take the earphones out. I was chatting with friends on a site when suddenly, I heard a woman's voice in my earphones. She said one word, but it didn't sound like anything I could understand. The voice wasn't English. My first instinct was to check my laptop to see if anything had popped up, advertisements or strange attachments. But there was nothing. I thought it might have just been something random, but then, a minute later, I heard the voice again. This time, it was a little clearer. It sounded like either kind-eek or kind. I tried to make sense of it, and eventually, I decided to look it up using a translator. According to the translator, the word meant infant. While I'm not sure if that's the exact translation, it felt like it fit with everything else I had experienced. I couldn't help but feel like there was something or someone sitting at the end of my bed at night or standing, watching me, just like the girl I saw. I told my parents, close friends, and grandparents about what had happened. My parents listened, but I could tell they didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, nor did my friends. It must sound a bit crazy to some people, but I can't ignore it when I've experienced these things myself. My granddad, however, was the only one who truly believed me. He had his own share of unexplainable experiences, and said that he could relate to what I was going through.